Hello and welcome to the Drydock episode 253. It is the end of the month, therefore it is the Patreon Drydock. But since I'm going to be in Australia for most of June, I'm obviously not going to be able to read and therefore answer the later arriving comments. So you're going to get part 1 this week, and instead of part 2 this week, you'll get part 2 next week, since I'll then have had time to process those. Nonetheless, Andre Decoult asks, which was more often used by ship's crews and officers during the Age of Sail? Fifth rate or frigate, third rate or two-decker, or first rate or three-decker, as in, regular talking orders or informing people, as opposed to writing officially in logs, written orders, or dispatches, as taking into consideration the ease versus difficulty of identification with the technology of the time and spotting a ship in the distance. I presume it was rather easier to tell the number of gun decks, certainly much earlier than making a positive idea about specific ship class or name. Now, obviously, this will vary over time, and for the particular dichotomy that we're talking about, we're essentially talking about the 1720s onwards up to the end of the Age of Sail, so kind of the last century of the classic Age of Sail. But in those cases, for a single gun deck vessel, i.e., fifth rates or sixth rates or frigates, the most common term that I've come across being used in recordings of spoken conversations, orders, etc., is just a generic frigate, because at long distance, which, as you rightly point out, it's rather difficult to tell precisely what you're facing off against. If you see a single gun deck vessel, it's a frigate. When you get closer, you might be able to discern either by the apparent size of the guns or the size of the ship, whether it's a fifth rate, a sixth rate, or maybe even one of the more heavily armed, unrated vessels. But the shorthand for single gun deck vessel was frigate, which is also why HMS Warrior, when she was initially launched, was described as a frigate, because even though she was more powerful than pretty much any ship of the line at the time, she only had a single gun deck. Now, earlier on in the time period that we're talking about, two-deck ships of the line could be fourth rates or third rates, but the 60-64 gunner two-decker, which is right on the border of third rate, but 50-55 gun, 60 gun, usually, well, those are fourth rates, and then the 64 technically is the lower bound of third rate. But reasonably often by the end of the Age of Sail, people were treating 64s mostly as fourth rates, even though they were technically thirds, because the 64s and below tended to have 24-pounder main gun decks, as opposed to the third rates, which had usually 32-pounder main gun decks, actually, i.e. the lowest gun deck. But anyway, the point is that those fourth rates and almost fourth rates were pretty much on the way out for the latter part of the classic Age of Sail. And so generally you will see two-decker ships described as third rates, because that's usually what they were. And usually they wouldn't say in conversation, oh, it's enemy third rate or whatever, or 3 third rates on the horizon. Quite often they would just reduce it to thirds, because everyone knew what you're talking about. They say, oh yes, 4 sail on the horizon. What are they? They look like thirds, sir. Everyone knows what you're talking about. For the bigger ships, the first and second rates, weirdly enough, after having had frigate and then third, first rates and second rates, there's a mixture of, sometimes they're just called firsts, the same way that some were called thirds, because always better to make the assumption that the enemy is the biggest it can be, rather than what's technically speaking a second rate. But a second rate, remember, can have 98 guns and a first rate can have 100, so may not actually make a huge amount of difference. But three-decker does crop up a reasonable amount, because, of course, you can say first as a shorthand, but with the prevalence of second rates at certain time periods, just saying it's a three-decker is a pretty good shorthand for it's a big ship that, if we're not another three-decker, we probably should either not fight or take significant care in preparing to fight. So it is a little bit varied, and of course this is in my experience of reading various sources. So other people's experience may vary. Another thing to mention just briefly is that certainly in the latter part of the 18th and early 19th centuries, there was also a habit of referring to two-deckers, i.e. and third rates, instead of just calling them thirds or third rates or whatever, just calling them 74s, because the 74-gun third rate was so common. If you saw a two-decker warship, a lot of people just assume it was a 74. Rebel Squirrel asks, the Battle of Wake Island, did the Japanese Navy learn anything from the experience that they applied to their later amphibious operations in 1942? I don't know precisely. I haven't seen a detailed breakdown of Japanese Navy lessons learned from the invasion of Wake Island, at least not recently. But you can draw some inferences from later Japanese amphibious operations. So yes, in some ways they do seem to have actually learned a few lessons. I mean, they learned some lessons very quickly from their first attempt to take Wake Island. They had to come back with a much bigger force. But when you look at Midway and its defences, now granted Midway had somewhat better defences than Wake Island, but not massively more. And when you look at the numbers of troops and the ships that the Japanese were committing to the invasion of Midway, which obviously didn't happen thanks to the Battle of Midway, whilst they only committed about twice as many troops as they eventually did to the invasion of Wake Island, when you look at the number and types of ships they sent in, and of course they were expecting the carriers to also chip in with strikes to whittle down Midway's air group, I would reckon that, yeah, they had learned a few lessons. They had so much more firepower present in terms of cruisers, destroyers, even and battleships. Even though they didn't have a particularly well-developed shore bombardment doctrine at that point, they still were bringing an awful lot of boom to the equation. So, yeah, I would say that they had learned the lesson that they needed a lot more and a lot more aggressive support for their troops, although obviously the time between Wake Island and the other amphibious operations they undertook in 1942 wasn't long enough for them to radically overhaul their entire amphibious force and, you know, come up with all sorts of additional things like you'd see at, say, something like D-Day. Sam Signorelli asks, how honest were the various navies with self-assessment after a battle, especially if they were on the losing end or they'd taken significant damage? And how did this change from conflict to conflict? How much self-delusion was going on? In terms of assessing how well or badly they'd done, which tactics did or didn't need to be changed, I would say it's probably a little bit misleading to say, right, well, in this particular war, this navy was very self-delusional or was actually really good at recognizing its own mistakes, because naval wars tend to be fairly large things, and whilst there are some cases where there's kind of an institutional blindness or arrogance involved, in a lot of cases it varies quite considerably even within a conflict. So if you look, for example, at the Guadalcanal campaign, something that almost always comes up with this kind of thing because it is the learning crucible of the US Navy in World War II, there are some admirals in the US Navy who both personally and in their post-battle assessments are, we can definitely tell now, and I think some of their contemporaries even could, are completely off the wall in terms of what actually happened versus what they're trying to maintain happened. Raging against reality. And at the same time, you also have other admirals who are very much on board with, yeah, this is exactly what went wrong and why. Now, that culture generally does shift as you get towards the end of the Guadalcanal campaign and then into 43 and 44. And broadly, the US Navy becomes much, much better at identifying, okay, we did well in this bit, we didn't do so well in this bit, this needs to be changed. But even towards the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, you had things like Admiral Wright, who, had absolutely convinced himself that the Japanese Navy had managed to sneak half a dozen submarines in between the Japanese resupply destroyers and his own fleet, and the Japanese destroyers magically became cruisers. And why exactly the Japanese were running a massive submarine escort on a bunch of destroyers or cruisers trying to do resupply missions, who knows, but, you know, he was twisting himself in circles trying to work out, you know, how he could possibly have lost. And when it's the senior officer on the ground or on the ship who is reporting this, you know, that limits the Navy's opportunity to learn. They don't really have too much choice other than to accept that version of events, unless, of course, it's so bad that massive numbers of people are turning around and going, actually, yeah, he may be our superior officer, but that's definitely not what happened. But at the same time, there were some navies where there was considerably more self-delusion going on, and that tended to be basically where the Navy was driven more by an ideology, or perhaps the Navy was being controlled by a government that was driven very much by an ideology, more so than operational reality. So at certain points, the Revolutionary era French and then Napoleonic navies, you know, you could have officers who could present, you know, fairly legitimate accounts of what went wrong, but then could end up on the receiving end of, well, I don't care why you failed, or clearly the reason you didn't win is you failed to display the correct revolutionary spirit, something that also pops up now and again in the Soviet Navy. It's almost like having massive, extremely heavily ideologically driven revolutions leads to a massive fall in the efficiency of your Navy, because you execute everyone who dares to say anything might be in any way, shape or form the slightest bit wrong. But nonetheless, then you also have, you know, the Imperial Japanese Navy, which sometimes could be a little bit, well, quite often actually in the Second World War, not so much in the Russo-Japanese War and so forth, but definitely by the Second World War, once you have the extreme hardliners take over, you would have some fairly decent, honest evaluations of what went wrong coming in from the field, but sometimes those would be tempered by either the senior officers out there being somewhat afraid of what would happen to them if they did give an honest answer, or then when it gets recycled back at home, it again, depending on who's doing the evaluation, sometimes does get dismissed outright. And that's obviously not a Japanese problem only, because, you know, in the US Navy, for example, it took a while for them to get their heads around the idea that, yes, just because the Japanese look different to you, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are inferior to you technologically, and they can actually come up with some fairly inventive things. Hence why, especially in the early part of the war, and maybe even in some parts of the latter part of the war, there was willingness to believe all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas before accepting the fact that actually, no, the Japanese just actually pulled off something that was pretty good. And for that matter, you know, even in World War I, if you look at some of the reports that come back from, well, as I've mentioned in the Dardanelles video, the whole raison d'etre behind the initial bombardment in 1914 at the Dardanelles, and then some of the reports that come back during the Dardanelles and then Gallipoli campaigns. Similarly, you know, the Royal Navy is not, as an institution, delusional about what happened when things went wrong during World War I as a collective organisation. Despite the fact of people like Beatty trying to put the best face on it, if you look at the work that was being done after Jutland to figure out why the battle cruisers exploded, there's a lot of very honest work going on there, obviously just being kept from the public view to try and keep the Germans from learning about it. But then you contrast that to some of the reports coming back from why haven't those annoying little inferior Ottomans keeled over and died yet? And you'd believe that half the German army was down there. I mean, there were Germans down there helping out with the defences, but the Ottomans were doing most of the legwork. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns, asks. At the bottom of page 25 of J.D. Brown's Carrier Operations in World War II, a picture shows a ferry Barracuda using a ski jump off of HMS Furious in Operation Mascot. I was wondering if you could possibly go into the dimensions of the ski jump and or provide information or reference material about the operation as pertaining to said ski jump. Unfortunately, it's not proven as easy as you might think to find specific details about the ski jump, or how it got there, or why it got there, or, you know, basically much of anything about it, to be honest. Other than the fact it existed, it was constructed entirely out of wood, which might be a bit of a giveaway from the photo, and it was put on Furious because, well, The Barracuda wasn't exactly the world's most blessed aircraft when it came to power-to-weight ratio in the first place, and it was being asked to launch off of Furious, which was not the world's largest carrier, and it was also being asked to haul a 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb around with it, all of which added up to significant concerns that even with everything set up as you can see here, the poor old Barracuda might just flop off the end of the carrier and fall into the sea. And so this ramp was developed, which is kind of basically a ski jump in most other words, which allowed the aircraft to take off by effectively artificially extending the length of Furious's flight deck. Basically what the ski jump does is that it changes the angle of attack of the aircraft, so therefore changing how the air affects it in terms of lift, and obviously is also slightly changing its trajectory into an upwards position, or slightly more upwards direction, which means that when the aircraft leaves the ski jump, it's now travelling in something of a ballistic arc, which gives it longer to increase its airspeed, as well as obviously putting it in a slightly better position to generate lift at low speeds anyway. However, it might interest you to know that this wasn't the first time that Furious had used some kind of ramp to help its aircraft take off. In fact, for a good chunk of the operational career of Furious, her forward flight deck did actually slope up at a point, and you can see this from some aerial photos and from some photos on Furious itself, which was basically designed to do the same thing. So Furious was not a stranger to giving its aircraft a little bit of an assist up into the sky by means of an inclined ramp. This was just an extension of that principle for Operation Mascot because of the limitations of the Barracuda with such a heavy load. Togfather asks, with the driving bands on shells being made of a different metal than the main body of the projectile, they obviously had to be manufactured separately and then attached. Firing the shell must have put enormous mechanical stress on the attachment. How were the bands attached to the shells? And were there ever problems with the bands becoming separated from the shell and causing the shell not to gain the required spin from the rifling? So the driving bands were usually made slightly oversized so that they would slip onto the shell. The shell would usually have a groove with normally some kind of little dovetail divot or raised jointing on it. Sometimes also the groove that would be cut could have an uneven surface like waves or curls or whatever to give better grip, and then a big press would come in and compress the band into place, and that would then lock it into place because obviously the band is made of a softer metal, so the banding press would compress it in, and then the driving band was now pretty much attached. In terms of what the stress imposed, obviously that being quite great, and the band is in the process of being sliced up by the rifling as well. Were there problems with bands becoming separated from the shell? Yes, that was a known problem. Obviously, as I said, the curved surfacing, various different textures of surfacing plus the dovetail joint plus the pressing were designed to prevent that, but didn't necessarily always do so. Bands could break, bands could fly apart, the pressing might fail. You might get slippage, all sorts of things depending on quality control and the forces being exerted and just general bad luck. And whilst it wasn't common, it was a well-known enough issue that when you look at artillery manuals of the time, particularly for obviously test ranges and so forth, they actually specify that when you go to examine a projectile that has gone wildly off course, one of the first things you should check is the state of the driving band to see if it's broken, slipped, or in some other way, not performed as function dictates that it should. And of course, that indicates you're firing inert training rounds, because if a AP round or a HE round lands and does its job, there won't be much of the driving band left to find. But this is it's a commonly acknowledged failure. But it is still not in and of itself supposed to be massively regularly occurring. So kind of like how if an accident investigator is looking at a car crash and they notice that there's a bunch of skid marks and then suddenly the car has obviously swerved to one side, and there's fragments of rubber on one side of the road, you might logically conclude, well, this was a tyre failure that has caused the car to veer off and crash. So everyone knows that tyre failures, tyre punctures, etc. are an not necessarily entirely expected, but a not unexpected feature of a number of car crashes, accidents, and just general problems with cars. But they're also not spectacularly common on a per vehicle mile basis. You know, most people who have driven cars regularly in their lives have experienced one or more tyre punctures, etc., but it's not something you just go out and expect to happen every third time you drive or something, unless you happen to live in the land of roads made of, like, wall tacks or something. Brian Stevens asks, seeing as the celebration of the colonies throwing off the yoke of George III is at hand, I thought I would ask a Revolutionary War era question. I understand that the war ended up sparking conflicts around the world. What did this mean for the deployment of the British fleet in this war with global reach? Well, it meant that over the course of the conflict, the Royal Navy was being stretched thinner and thinner and thinner, because what started off as, technically speaking, an internal conflict within the British Empire very rapidly escalated, because the French and then the Spanish and the Dutch all turned around and went, well, we're not necessarily in favour of colonies rebelling against their rightful masters, because, of course, all the French, the Spanish and the Dutch all had colonies that they really, really would rather not rebel against them. But we are in favour of people kicking the teeth in of the British, and we'd like to get in on some of that action. And so what initially should have been a relatively easy action for the Royal Navy, committing a small part of its strength to dealing with whatever privateers and small naval craft the Continental Navy was able to put out, suddenly became, oh, there's French fleets and Spanish fleets and Dutch fleets all over the place, plus the nascent Continental Navy, and then those various other fleets keep showing up in the environment that we're trying to fight in North America, well, off the coast of North America. And now they're taking our colonies away elsewhere, so we have to go and take their colonies away elsewhere, and we have to protect our own colonies, and we have to attack trade, and we have to defend our trade. And all of a sudden, you're basically fighting a complete global war at sea, whilst simultaneously also trying to fight a land war on, okay, what's not quite the continental United States at that point, but still the East Coast, i.e. the 13 colonies, is a pretty darn big chunk of territory to be fighting a land campaign on, especially for a nation like Britain, which historically doesn't have that large of an army. So yeah, the deployments of the Royal Navy, even though they are obviously building more ships and bringing ships out of ordinary and putting them back into action all through the war, the Royal Navy is being further and further and further stretched, which inevitably ends up contributing to the overall British loss. Things like the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, Battle of Virginia Capes, as you can see here. But because, as I said, the Royal Navy is getting stronger all the time as it's bringing more ships online from either the reserves or from new build, it does mean that whilst obviously Britain has to cede the 13 colonies to what is now the United States, they do manage to pull off some sort of last gasp victories, fairly big naval victories in the Caribbean against the French. And so whilst overall the war does not go very well and leaves the Royal Navy stretched out all over the place, by the end of it, the British are beginning to, if not gain the upper hand, at least push back against the mostly Franco-Spanish ships. The Dutch are kind of involved, but they don't have a huge amount of success. And therefore, the peace treaty terms at the Peace of Paris and the various treaties that are signed are nowhere near as bad for Britain as they would have been if you'd looked at signing those same treaties 6 months earlier. Little Dweller asks, I'm curious about the operation of escort carriers with the Atlantic convoys during World War II. Did their aircraft patrol, or did they launch in response to a U-boat sighting? Were the aircraft able to spot a submerged U-boat? And what weapons did they carry? Depth charges or bombs? I assume they weren't using torpedoes. Were they able to destroy many U-boats, or was their main value in keeping U-boats submerged so they couldn't keep up with the convoy, or just at too great a distance to attack? Escort carriers on convoy escort would change their operational method depending on the circumstances. Bearing in mind, obviously, the Allies do have access to Ultra, Bletchley Park, etc. So if they are sailing in an area where they know pretty certain that there aren't going to be many U-boats, then they might have an aircraft or two on standby ready to go, but that's probably about it. Also, in those kind of areas, they might have cover from land-based aircraft. So, for example, a convoy that's leaving New York or something, or Halifax or something like that. But let's say you're now in mid-ocean and you're perhaps beyond the range of land-based aircraft, or later in the war, perhaps there's just very occasionally a land-based aircraft might make it out there. So you know this is the area where U-boats are going to be hunting quite a lot. Perhaps Ultra has said you expect U-boat activity over the next couple of days. At that stage, pretty much the same thing on the Arctic convoys, you will have regular patrols of aircraft going up. And typically those would be aircraft that were equipped with radar, so Swordfish with ASV was a big favourite, but they could also be just aircraft with lookouts and so on and so forth. And they could obviously sweep in pre-arranged patterns ahead of the convoy. They could circle around the convoy because U-boats could theoretically come from any direction. They could go and investigate contacts that had been heard or detected by the escorts. They could conduct certain sweeps in certain directions based off of intel that had been signaled to them. There's a whole range of things they could do. But whilst they had aircraft up, if they thought there was a chance of running into U-boats, they usually would have another aircraft or two warmed up and ready to go just in case, because you might have an aircraft on one side of the convoy when an escort says, hey, I found a sub, and it's on the other side of the convoy. At which point, with minutes being critical, it might be easier to just go, okay, guy on deck, go that way, and send him off. Or you might find a submarine, you start attacking it, and then the aircraft goes, oh, hang on a minute, I'm running low on fuel, I need to come home. So another aircraft can be dispatched to go and continue the prosecution relatively quickly. They would usually carry a mixture of depth charges and bombs, sometimes rockets as well, depending on what kind of thing they're expecting to come across. Because, of course, depth charges are great for dropping on submarines that are submerged, but aircraft in World War II are not particularly good at detecting submerged submarines, and depth charges tend to weigh a fair bit as well, so you're going to carry a few of them. So, whilst they would sometimes carry them, bombs and rockets are the more typical fare because they're much more useful against a surfaced target, or in bombs' case, a slightly submerged target. In terms of could they spot a submerged U-boat? At very shallow depths on a clear day with a good amount of sunlight, potentially, if the sub hasn't gone very far. But that's much more of a thing in shallow Pacific waters or the Mediterranean than it is on the North Atlantic routes, for the most part. Were they able to destroy many U-boats? A reasonable number. The thing is that when you look at numbers of U-boats killed by escort carrier aircraft, you have to try and disentangle the kills from escort carriers that were escorting convoys, which obviously will also have assistance from the various other escorts, with those possibly even the same escort carriers who may have also scored kills against U-boats when they're out doing other stuff, like even being part of U-boat hunting packs, along with destroyer escorts and frigates. But the suppression value of all escorts, whether they be the aircraft, the escort carrier, the frigates, etc., in just keeping the U-boats down and away, was also very, very significant. David Stange Jr. asks, at what time in history is it generally acknowledged that the British Navy was the most powerful in the world? There's arguments that go back and forth over the 1700s and early 1800s, because arguably for a good chunk of the 1700s, the Royal Navy is the single most powerful navy on the planet, but it's also very frequently facing off against coalitions of other navies that massively outnumber it, and it's relying more on technology and training than numerical force to be the most powerful in the world. And at points is at a disadvantage when enough people gang up on it. And that kind of runs through even as far as, the Napoleonic Wars. Individually, if you're looking at the big navies, individually, Royal Navy ships usually have the advantage, and there are a lot of Royal Navy ships, but there are enough French and Spanish ships, especially since the French have this really, really annoying habit of constantly building massive numbers of ships to replenish the ones the Royal Navy keeps stealing, that when you look at something like, Napoleon's more ambitious plans for what eventually turned into the Trafalgar campaign, if the Franco-Spanish fleet had managed to put all of its ships of the line together in one place, they would have rivaled, if not outnumbered, the British capability to put a similar number of ships of the line of similar power in one place. But most of the time where there's relatively little argument is after 1805, after the Battle of Trafalgar, partly because the Franco-Spanish Navy, especially from its ships of the line, has taken such a hit, and also because the British then use that to assert kind of a blockade dominancy that they don't give up for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. Then, of course, you have the Pax Britannica running through to World War I, and Britain basically stays as the biggest and most powerful navy all the way through that. And then you finally have the period between the end of World War I and World War II, where, again, you do get some argumentation going on back and forth. Arguably, if you want, with most ways you want to quantify things, the Royal Navy still remains the most powerful navy on the planet throughout the interwar period. The treaty, the Washington Naval Treaty, that is, ostensibly says that the Royal Navy and the US Navy are at parity, but the US Navy lacks in certain areas during the 20s and early 30s, particularly in terms of smaller vessels, and there's arguments to be made over the fact that the Royal Navy actually has quite a substantial number of capital ships that are faster than the standards, and potentially better armed, depending again on how you want to argue things. The Royal Navy certainly has a lot more carriers up until the end of the 1930s, albeit they're individually smaller. But this is why it's an area of argumentation. But then you have the flip side, which is, when did the US Navy become the most powerful navy in the world? Most people tend to gravitate to some point in 1943, which would suggest if they became the most powerful navy in the world in 1943, someone else was on top before that, and obviously the immediate candidate would be the Royal Navy. So you've kind of got an 1805 to 1919, 1920 definite period, and you may have sort of 20 years-ish, 20 plus years after that, and you may have up to a century before that, depending on exactly what metrics you want to use. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School Training Vessel Harakaze asks, what, in your opinion, are the real stories about why U-530 and U-977 surrendered in Argentina and their activities before coming into port? Obviously, I can't prove anything, particularly with regards to those two submarines, but based on their activities, or what we know of their activities, based on the activities of certain German officials at the time, who obviously, for rather understandable reasons, didn't particularly fancy being in Germany that was about to be overrun by mostly the Red Army, but also the Allied armies, and also based on some of the artifacts that come out of U-537, which is the sub up in Liverpool. I kind of suspect there was a bit more to it than the ostensible, we wanted to surrender to the Argentinians or go and live in Argentina because we thought it might be better than Germany. Now, whether or not... there's obviously rumours constantly of Nazi gold this, high-ranking Nazis that, and to be fair, a lot of reasonable number of high-ranking Nazis did escape and try and live in various places, including Argentina. I don't necessarily think the submarines were being used as transports for high-ranking Nazi individuals. It's possible, maybe, but I personally wouldn't put any real amount of money on it. However, in terms of a more general kind of, not necessarily a last redoubt, but kind of keep the dream alive effort, which a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but some people will try and convince you that the Nazis had an Antarctic super base or something like that. But, in that sort of last ditch, let's take some samples of our best technology and, try and keep at least some element of the Third Reich alive as a colony somewhere that's a bit more sympathetic to their views. That I can believe. People deciding, perhaps with some non-standard crew or whatever, that, we're going to take a bunch of stuff and we're going to set ourselves up as, a little power base somewhere else where people won't come after us potentially for the things that we've done, or just, as looking at what happened to Germany after World War I, perhaps being extremely heavily disarmed, and if these people are, convinced that they want to have some kind of military role, they don't want to end up being just on the back burner of everybody else for ages. So, yeah, I think there's a little bit more to it than just sailing up to Argentina to surrender to try and begin a new life. I think they were planning something a little bit more complex, and the number of Germans that pop up suspiciously in Argentina in the post-war period, I think kind of speaks a little bit to that. But exactly to what extent this was planned, and to what extent this was maybe just a small group of people or individual subs deciding to do this, I don't know. And I suspect at this stage we probably won't know. Greg M. asks, when a wooden warship was sent to the breakers, what happened? What were they looking to salvage, and what was the market for used parts of a wooden warship? Well, it very much depends on what state the ship is in at the time. I think, my memory set serves, I have answered a similar question to this before, because I had this picture in storage apart from anything else. But nonetheless, assuming the ship isn't just completely rotten through, at which point obviously most of the timbers are just going to get ditched, the main things the Navy is looking to salvage is just good usable timber. Now, the external planking may or may not fit that criteria, but certainly the ribs, the framing, etc., those big bits of oak, those could quite often be reused, especially in an era where ship design isn't changing all that much. Now, obviously they might have to be slightly reshaped or repurposed, but if you've got the big timbers for a 74 gunner that's being broken up, you can probably reuse a fair bit of that in a new 74 gunner. And as I said, obviously you might have to reshape them, you might have to use them in slightly different positions, so you can't deviate too much from the original design, because you can't add wood back onto them if you want a single piece of timber, and anything you remove to adjust the size, the fit, is going to make it slightly weaker, but it is still all good timber. And if nothing else, you can cut it up into shorter lengths, which can then be used for shoring up, and later on when you get to the end of the Age of Sail, so the early 1800s, early 19th century, and you have Seppings and Simmons coming in, then actually that increases the amount of wood that can be salvaged from older ships, because then even if the framing is completely different from the ship you're breaking up, you can still cut those big timbers up into shorter sections and use them in the diagonal cross bracing, which was then all the rage. The really small stuff isn't really much odds. Obviously they'd be looking for brass and iron fittings as well, so gun port lid hinges, bits of brass, the ship's wheel, the rudder clasps, this kind of stuff. All of that would easily be repurposed, as would most of the stuff for the rigging. But sometimes there just wasn't the call for it. So obviously this posits a scenario where the Royal Navy is actively building plenty of wooden warships at the same time as they're breaking up older ones. In significant peace times, when the Royal Navy might not be building anything, and might not be planning on building anything major for a reasonable time in the future, then some of the really big, really valuable stuff might still go into storage in shipyards, but a lot more of that might just be disposed of. And it might just be, okay, who wants this big lump of timber? Please just take it away, get it out of my sight. But it might also be sold on to local or not so local construction efforts, which can be, although urban legends are much more rife on this than actual fact, but can be the source of big timbers in houses and such. You know, if a house or an inn or something's being constructed or refurbished at the time, they may buy some cheap discount seasoned wood from the Royal Navy to help construct their homes, and so on and so forth. The market for used parts outside of timber usually wasn't actually that great, because most of the non-timber stuff, as I said, could be easily repurposed most of the time, and the wood, only in periods of extreme peace would any significant amount of non-rotted timber be hived off or sold from the dockyards. Now, the rotted or perished stuff, that's a slightly different matter, because, of course, a big rib or, one of these frame pieces of timber, or just a good solid chunk of timber like you can see sticking up out the stern of this ship here, if that's rotted through part way up, or it's rotted through to 25% of its depth, in and of itself that piece of timber is no longer really of much use to the Navy. So that kind of stuff, even if it's just wear and tear, that might get chucked out or sold out. But what's needed to hold up a ship that weighs several thousand tons is different to what might be needed to hold up a house that might weigh a few dozen, at which point, that again is a good source of those kinds of timbers that get used in civilian construction, because you just take the timber, you saw off the 25% that's rotten, and theoretically the 75% should be good enough. Cisco Fan asks, did Shokaku sink faster because of the crude oil in her tanks? I've heard some historians say that the more volatile fuel burned faster and doomed her more quickly. I think any contribution by the admittedly somewhat more volatile than average bunker fuel that Shokaku was carrying had a relatively minimal overall impact on her sinking, because the torpedo hits from Kavala immediately ruptured one of the main aviation gasoline tanks, caused a massive fire, and those fires continued to spread. Now, depending on which accounts you believe, the Japanese got some level of control over those, either partial or total. More accounts suggest partial, and then they start to flare up again. But then later on, the aviation gas fuel fumes caught fire, and as with Lexington, as with so many Japanese ships at Midway, and as with a number of ships in other circumstances, avgas fume, boom, lots of fire, lots of explosions everywhere, people screaming, people dying, ship goes down. Plus, it had a bunch of massive torpedo holes in it, which aren't usually that good for a ship's overall capability to stay on the surface. Now, granted, the near enough crude oil that was being used as fuel by the Japanese at this stage did outgas various volatile fumes in and of itself, which wouldn't have helped if its fuel tanks were breached, as well as the avgas tanks, and those fumes were allowed to percolate. But to be perfectly honest, all they would have done is slightly added to the massive explosions that were in the end caused by the avgas fumes. So, it might have made those final fires just that little bit more flammable, but Shokaku was doomed either way, and any acceleration on her sinking would have been marginal at best, in my opinion. Nicholas Ressar asks, I saw a video thumbnail claiming that Shinano was a supercarrier. Is it? I know Shinano was large, but does that alone qualify it as a supercarrier? Well, it depends on how you define supercarrier, which seems to be a bit of a moving target. I mean, the original, well, not the original, but the first dedicated carrier, HMS Argus, the 1930s one, was at one point described as a supercarrier because of its size and impressiveness. And that was by the American press, not even by the British. And then you have, I remember when I was a teenager, some people, in fact a fair number of people, would have described the start of the supercarriers as the Midway class. And later, some people said, oh, okay, maybe Midway is a very large carrier, but is she a supercarrier? Maybe, maybe not. And they'd then move the start of the supercarriers to the forestals. But it pretty much always has been based on size, which roughly translates to displacement. The Midways were a huge jump above the Essexes, so hence why they could be described as supercarriers. And of course, by the end of their careers, especially with Midway, albeit with slightly more edges, she did very closely resemble the larger ships that were very definitely supercarriers. More recently, of course, and this is where, unfortunately, this is one of the reasons why I don't tend to cover things past 1950, you get some very weird nationalist chest beating where people try and redefine things, because obviously for decades and decades and decades, the US Navy was the only Navy that had carriers, Midway size and above, which meant that people somehow, or at least some people, got it into their heads that only the US Navy could have supercarriers, which was fine right up until the Royal Navy built the Queen Elizabeths, which at somewhere between 65 and 70,000 tons, they merit the designation supercarrier by displacement by a long way. But then something like, oh no, those are not supercarriers. But if Midway is, and she started off at 45,000 tons, and she wasn't 65,000 tons even in her final state, and the Forestals and the Kitty Hawks are a little bit under 65,000 tons regular displacement, then are they no longer supercarriers? Do you have to advance to USS Enterprise and the Nimitz, i.e. CVN-65 and the Nimitz, to now say, now only these are supercarriers, and we have to invent some strange midway term for the others just to keep Queen Elizabeth out of the supercarrier club? Because the thing is, if Queen Elizabeth is a supercarrier and Forrestal and Kitty Hawk are supercarriers, then Shinano is arguably a supercarrier, because she also displaces 65-ish thousand tons. But, that's now, if you don't want to call it a supercarrier, then you have to expand and refine the definition of supercarrier beyond just the simple displacement measure, which has historically been kind of the rule of thumb. And then you have to start looking at air group capabilities and so forth. Now, if you want to look at air group capabilities, theoretically, you can actually make a strong argument to disqualify Shinano from being a supercarrier on the basis that her active air complement was actually very small. Something like USS Saipan actually could mount more combat aircraft, but that's because Shinano was designed as a support carrier and could carry lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of aircraft to support other vessels, but she was never designed as a full fleet carrier. If she had been, she probably could have supported a lot more aircraft, which might then have kicked her back into that definition by air group. So it's a little bit of a back and forth that, to be honest, if anything, just exposes how loose and relatively unfounded the term supercarrier is, because essentially these days, and for a long time, I think, supercarrier has just meant the biggest and best carrier, which then people are like, but therefore only we can have it, and start tying themselves in all sorts of fun circles trying to define why everybody else's carriers are not, which is just silly. SynchroScore asks, nowadays countries are very concerned about advanced technologies getting into the hands of their rivals and enemies. I was wondering about the early age of iron and steam, when there was less government regulation on business. Did countries have export controls on things like Parsons turbines, Schneider guns, and Krupp armour plate, or could companies sell to pretty much anyone as long as they had the cash? Very much the latter. There were ships built in German yards with Vickers and Armstrong guns. There were ships built in British yards with Krupp guns. The reason that we refer to Krupp steel, Krupp armour plate, is because, well, Krupp invented it. They then sold both it and the methods of making it to anyone who wanted to buy. And so everyone started using it. The same with Harvey steel. Warships were going out left, right, and centre. Very often, warships that were being sold overseas were actually, technically speaking, more capable than the ones that were being built for the home navies. One of the early Prussian ironclads built in Britain was, by pretty much any account, more powerful than any single ironclad in the Royal Navy at the time. It's just that margin of superiority was maybe like 10-15%, and Britain had a lot of ironclads, so they didn't really care that much. And the list goes on. when you start getting the naval arms races, people started getting a bit more closed in about things. But even in, once the Anglo-German naval arms race had really gotten going, and bear in mind it kind of had gotten going in the pre-dreadnought era, but by the latter part of the 1900s, when the Germans were considering, well, how are we going to power our first dreadnoughts, the Nassaus, they seriously looked into Parsons turbines. The British weren't exactly restricting the sale of Parsons turbines. Parsons were quite happy to sell the Germans turbines. In fact, the only reason the Nassaus ended up with vertical triple expansion engines rather than turbines, apart from the fact the Germans didn't think they could manufacture their own at quite that stage. Obviously, they did very shortly thereafter, but at the stage the Nassau's design was being considered was simply because the Germans thought that the Parsons were charging far too much for them, and they didn't want to pay what Parsons were asking. But also around about the 1900s is when you start to see the first elements of, if you like, national security protectionism on trade, even though it was semi-governmental, also very patriotic businesses not selling things. So, for example, in the mid-1900s and going even into the late 1900s, if you looked at most British battleship shells, the fuses that were installed on them were made by Krupp, because Krupp made the best fuses, so why not buy from them? And then, as the Anglo-German naval arms race heated up, Krupp stopped selling them to Britain, which is, at its root, part of the reason why British fuses sucked somewhat during the First World War, because suddenly British firms that hadn't actually had to manufacture a frontline naval fuse for 5-10 years were suddenly being told, no, well, we can't buy any more from Krupp, so someone better come up with something about as good. So they were scrambling to catch up, mistakes were made, problems with shells and their fuses ensued, etc., etc. But that's kind of where it all starts, and then everything gets further and further closed as time goes on. But yeah, if you want the Age of Iron and Steel, anyone could pretty much rock up with a cash and buy anything. I mean, heck, look at the Italians. They bought the 100-ton guns. The British at that time couldn't come up with a ship that was big enough to mount the 100-ton guns, despite the fact the 100-ton gun was built in Britain. And so the Italians ended up with the 100-ton gun out at sea, and the British had to content themselves with sticking some on Malta and Gibraltar as a counter. Texas and La Shock asks, I listened to a podcast a while ago about the life of Marvel Comics legend Stan Lee and how he was involved in the creation of comic-like training materials for army recruits. The idea being that these were young men who'd grown up reading comic books and so would respond better to that format. Given how Stan and others such as Walt Disney, Chuck Jones, etc. were tapped for training and propaganda purposes, where can we find their work in naval materials? Well, pretty much look for training films. Now, admittedly, Stan Lee in particular was working for the Army Signal Corps, so most of his work will have centred around Army training films. But if you're looking at the general pool of people, some of whom you mentioned in the question, then yeah, basically look at any of the animated training films or cartoon-style, comic-style animated posters that the Navy employed, and almost certainly one or more of the people you listed or other similar people will end up being involved in some way, either as editors, creators, script writers, etc., etc. So this comic panel here, obviously the week after Pearl Harbor, that was scripted by Stan Lee, for example. So if you want to see a whole ton of them, I mean, you can try looking on YouTube for World War II US Navy training films, and obviously just looking for the animated ones as opposed to the live action ones. But you can also look to a certain degree, if you know the right keywords, on the NARA website, the US National Archives website. Alec Ruby asks, I've seen a number of arguments circulating on the internet about the actual effectiveness of the Iowa-class deck armour scheme compared to Bismarck, King George V and the Littorio class. What's your take on the subject? Maybe a ranking? Well, here's one of those many comparative armour scheme cross-sections. Now, I'm not going to talk about specific locations of certain things like 5-inch magazines and so forth within the ships, because the question is just about the effectiveness of the deck armour scheme generally, rather than at specific locations. And you'll notice, I know, before anyone points out, the Iowa class scheme is not here, but the South Dakota class scheme is. And if you look at a diagram of the Iowa class deck armor scheme and the South Dakota scheme, outside of a few very minor changes to dimensions, the principle of the scheme is pretty much the same. So we can use it as a reference because the minor differences in thickness not really going to make a huge amount of odds in the overall assessment. Now, let's take a look. So what do we have? These are kind of obviously half sections, or almost half sections in the case of something like Littorio. You'll immediately notice that there are essentially two ways of approaching this. That's a bit of a lie. There are two immediately obvious ways of approaching this. With the Bismarck class and the Littorio class, which are two of the four we've been asked to consider, you'll see that the main armor deck sits somewhat lower in the ship. It sits 2 decks below the upper deck, whereas on the South Dakota and also on the Iowa and on the King George V, as you can see there, both of them have their main armor deck a deck higher, so it's only 1 deck below the upper deck. Now, does this make much difference? Well, yes, it does, actually. Theoretically, a higher mounted armor deck will have more effect on stability. A lower mounted armor deck, therefore, has less effect on stability, which means, in theory, if you can spare the displacement, you can make that armor thicker. If you actually choose to do that, which is a separate matter. And that's because you've got essentially 3 different armor schemes represented. The American armor scheme, I'm just going to use that as a shorthand. The British armor scheme are both classic all or nothing designs. The Bismarck is a reworked version of the distributed protected deck armor scheme common in World War I battleships. It's evolved from that. And the Italian scheme, well, it's got its own thing going on, as most of the time the Italians tend to do. Nonetheless, the point of deck armor is firstly to deflect shells, and secondly, especially growing in more importance during World War II, to stop bombs. Now, obviously you then want to protect your citadel, and ideally you want your citadel to be as high a volume as you can get without massively overloading your ship with armor, because there are certain restrictions when it comes to citadels, and one of those restrictions is that the citadel, at least in theory, on 99% of all ships ever built with an armoured citadel, going all the way back to Warrior, which originated the armoured citadel, that is supposed to keep enough reserve buoyancy that the rest of your ship could be flooded and it would remain afloat. So, in theory, you could riddle every single compartment aft of Warrior Citadel and forward of Warrior Citadel, and although it might be a bit waterlogged and low in the water, Warrior would still keep afloat as long as its Citadel remains unbreached. One of the major criticisms of the Bismarck class, in my opinion, is that the Bismarck, if it's in that very, very, very tiny percentage of ships where it really doesn't actually matter whether you penetrate the Citadel or not, because if you flood enough of the areas outside the Citadel, there's not enough reserve buoyancy in it to keep the ship afloat, and it will sink anyway. Now, that's a disadvantage of having your armor deck lower. It lowers the volume of your citadel. But there are other things. So I think first bombs, which are easier to look at. So with bombs, you'll notice everybody has an upper armored deck. On Bismarck, it's the thickest of all. And then you've got Iowa and the Littorios, and then I mean, the British is comparable, but a lot of these armor decks, people measure the actual deck plating as well as the armor that's been stuck on top of it in addition, which, as you know from many times I've mentioned it, is less effective than just a single thickness. And also sometimes some diagrams will group together the deck and the deck plating and the armor plating, which is equally unhelpful. But nonetheless, the point of that upper armor deck in terms of the incoming bomb is to arm the bomb's fuse. So if it's a high explosive or general purpose bomb, the bomb may detonate almost immediately or very shortly thereafter. And if it's an armor-piercing bomb, the fuse is at least initiated, and the bomb is somewhat slowed, maybe has its direction changed, maybe its body is a bit damaged. You then have the main armor deck. This is supposed to actually stop the bomb, resist it coming through, and then you'll also notice beneath the American and British schemes, and somewhat beneath the Italian scheme, at least outboard where the Pugliese system is, you have a further system, very thin, admittedly, usually about just deck plating thickness. In the King George V, it's D steel, STS in the Iowas, etc. And that's supposed to catch splinters. So acknowledging that if someone drops a pretty big bomb on you, it may partially make it through your main deck armor. It might not make it through, but it might spall pieces off of your deck armor, or small fragments might make it through your deck armor. And you don't want those continuing further down, because that could hit things like magazines, it could hit the engines, the machinery, which is what most of these cross-sections show. And therefore you have basically a backstop, a catcher plate, if you like. And some ships, if you look at this diagram, well, on the Littorio, the 24mm plate certainly, and the 36mm plate to a certain extent serves both functions. But in the King George V, there's a 22mm plate, as well as some other bulkheads. You have a similar system for the torpedo defense system. Bismarck has the same thing with a 45mm plate, which is designed to finally catch fragments and bits and pieces and last ergs of explosion coming through from a torpedo impact. So this scheme is, relatively well established. Now, if you have an deck armor plate that's lower in the ship, like the 2-deck lower schemes, on the Axis ships, then that gives the bomb more time to explode, which means the bomb is less likely to exert all of its force or most of its force on your armor deck, and therefore your armor deck is more likely to resist it, which theoretically is a good thing. Conversely, if the bomb doesn't explode on its way down, and it actually hits the armor deck and keeps going, then if it does penetrate, or even if spalling or fragmentation gets through, you'll see with Bismarck, there's nothing to stop further issues being caused in fairly important places. So if a bomb drops through the 50mm deck, it's going to go through that 20mm deck in between. So if an armor-piercing bomb hits the deck armor of a Bismarck-class battleship, the main deck armor, over the machinery or over the magazines, if splinters or spalling occur underneath, let alone the bomb actually passing through, those splinters spalling going directly into a protected space, you really, really don't want hot splinters and spalling in, which is bad. Whereas on the King George V and American schemes, then you've got, although the bomb is more likely to interact with the deck armor in the first place, you do have these catching areas, which basically splinter plates, which might catch the fragments, and it's a last ditch to stop those fragments getting into the bits you really don't want them to. The other thing is, of course, if the bomb does penetrate the deck armor, to be perfectly honest, having 12mm or 20mm of steel in the intermediate deck is going to not make the blindest bit of difference to a 1,000-pound or 1,600-pound bomb. But the main armor deck might. So, the British and American schemes actually have an advantage, I think, there, because if a bomb does hit the main armor deck, and if it goes through, it will be significantly slowed, it will be significantly damaged, and there is a chance, a reasonable one, but maybe not always, but somewhat, that the bomb will therefore go off immediately beneath the armor deck in that second deck, you're still going to get a lot of fragments and spalling and explosions happening down in the machinery spaces or the magazines, which is not good, but it's likely to be much reduced as compared to a Bismarck or Littorio, where if a bomb punches through the main armor deck, the bomb itself is now inside the bit you really, really don't want it to be. So in that case, the King George V and Iowa schemes, I personally think, have an advantage, certainly over the Bismarck scheme. The Littorio scheme, with that 24mm plate, at least if there's hits on the outer thirds, roughly speaking, of the ship, has a little bit of that catching going on, but it's still going to be vulnerable over the amidships area. And thicknesses, they are what they are. If you look at the various thicknesses, you'll notice that, theoretically speaking, over the magazines, the British and the Italians have the thickest main deck armour. The thinnest over the magazines actually goes to Bismarck, and over the machinery spaces it also goes to Bismarck. In fact, the British and American ships have considerably thicker main deck armour. Now, so that's bombs. So bombs, I'd give the Allied ships the advantage. Shells, however, are another thing entirely, because shells are coming in horizontally. Now, if the shell is rejected by the deck armour, or explodes on contact with the deck armour, basically it doesn't penetrate the deck armour, then pretty much the same thing applies as it does for bombs. So the British and American designs have the advantage. But if the shell is coming in on the belt, hit on the belt armour, i.e. a mostly horizontal strike, then things start to get interesting. Now, the Italian scheme doesn't have, its main deck is still capping the side plate, the main belt. So that doesn't actually help all that much. And then you've got this 36mm plate and a 24mm plate, which arguably could catch fragments if a shell penetrates the main armour plate. But they're not actually, well, you could argue the 24mm is maybe part of the deck armour scheme. The 36mm is definitely part of the belt armour scheme. But the main armour belt, the main armoured belt deck is not helping if a shell comes through horizontally. Likewise, with both the American and British schemes, if a shell manages to make it through the side, the main belt, because the armour decks are that deck higher and they're capping off the main belt, they will not help any to stop a shell coming through. You do have, as you can see on the King George V's, a 22mm bulkhead coming up from the torpedo defence system that might stop some fragments or whatever, maybe slow the shell down a little bit. On the Americans' side, you've got the inclined armour, but not really much behind that in terms of dedicated bulkheads. But on the Bismarck class, and this is where a lot of people like to sort of champion the Bismarcks, you have the protected deck scheme, this kind of turtle back scheme. And if a shell makes it through Bismarck's armour, then in theory, the main armour deck is there to catch and prevent the shell from progressing any further. There are, so that would suggest perhaps Bismarck's scheme is a bit more effective. However, there are two major weaknesses, well, actually three major weaknesses with this argument. The first of which is that because of the additional weight that this scheme requires Bismarck to carry, its armour, in terms of effective thickness, is arguably the lowest. So the American armour is theoretically maximal, in terms of maximum thickness, slightly thinner, but it's heavily angled. So at medium to long ranges, the effective thickness is greater. So the armour provides a bit more protection. This is the belt armour. King George V is just slab-sided and is just thicker, so provides more protection. The Italian belt is thinner, but then you have this decapping system. If it works, and you know my thoughts on that, whether it may or may not work, but if it does work, its effective resistance is also greater than Bismarck's. So on the one hand, yes, Bismarck does have this deck armour that will resist shells that make it through the belt armour. On the other hand, it's much more likely to get shells penetrating through the belt armour in the first place, which you probably don't want. And obviously if they do, then the shell may explode, and if the shell explodes on that belt armour, then that may induce, again, spalling, fragments, etc., etc., all the stuff we discussed before, at which point that deck armour is just going to send bits flying into the bits you really don't want hot fragments to be, as we said before. So, swings and roundabouts with that one, I guess. But in theory, I think that's probably the one place you could argue, if it works completely as designed, Bismarck's deck armour might help. And although, as I've said before, and as you've seen me demonstrate before, I still have a number of reservations based on engineering knowledge about the idea generally. So, yeah, overall, I'm not... I personally wouldn't necessarily go and say, okay, this particular one is superior in all cases, this other one is inferior in all cases, and so forth, back and forth, because, well, as you can see, there are varying armor thicknesses over different parts for magazines and machinery on some designs. Additionally, and there's issues about what the deck armor will do in the event of impacts on other parts of the ship's armor, and so on and so forth. But in terms of overall design principles, I think the armor deck that caps your belt, i.e. Littorio, American and British designs, is overall a superior system, because with its ability to have a splinter plate deck beneath, at least on the British and American systems, it is more likely to prevent bomb fragments and direct impact shell fragments from getting to places that you really, really would rather it didn't. And also it means that, assuming it resists the impact, the explosion is going to, obviously it's going to affect some parts of the ship, but it's going to affect less of the ship because it can only, again, assuming the armor holds, affect a single deck layer of the ship and the superstructure. With the Bismarcks and the Littorios, even if the deck armor works exactly the same as the American and British armor, that explosion now is ripping through 2 decks worth of stuff. And if it's on the outer part of Bismarck, 2.5 decks worth of stuff, which is not good. And is possibly, especially in Bismarck's case, worryingly close to the waterline if fragments get out and start causing leaks, or go down and start causing leaks, etc., etc. When it comes to resisting shell fire that is interacting with the belt armor, if it works as designed, theoretically Bismarck's deck armor layout would be somewhat better at shorter ranges, at longer ranges, where the shell might just come over through the upper armor strake and so forth, and potentially even start impacting the angled part of the deck armor, maybe not so much. So at longer ranges, Bismarck would be a disadvantage. The Italian scheme, and the British schemes, which incorporate catcher plates, the Italian scheme, especially with 36 and 24mm, as opposed to the British with just the 22, those would probably be slightly better, but those catching plates for the most part are not part of the deck armor scheme, except arguably maybe with the Italians. But as I said, the flip side is the Iowa and King George V layout allows you to be more likely to resist the shells coming through the side in the first place anyway, which, you know, is better than coping with the explosion inside your ship. Now, I realise that while that doesn't necessarily involve a ranking like you maybe asked for, but if you consider the 3 main potential ways of analysing this, which is the bomb impacts, the direct shell impacts, and then potential interactions of the deck armour with shells that penetrate the belt armour, as long as you consider what that belt armour's resistive capability is as a result of the other elements of the armour scheme, including the deck armour, I personally would say that the Iowa King George V style layout, which is also obviously the layout in the South Dakotas, the North Carolinas, and to a certain extent actually also on the Richelieus, which are a whole separate kettle of fish, the principles behind those armour layouts, I think, are superior in those 2 cases to the Bismarck and partially the Littorio. The Bismarck's armour scheme could work better in terms of its deck armour in the last case of shells coming through the belt armour, but A, only if it works as advertised, B, only if it works at all, and C, there are a lot of caveats to that, as I've explained previously and as I've explained in this. So qualified close-range superiority of deck armour layout for Bismarck, if you happen to be fighting a close-range engagement where shells are punching through your armour in the first place. Even with horizontal hits at medium to medium, long to long ranges, I'd actually still rate the British and American, and for that matter Italian schemes as superior, because they're more likely to keep the shells out in the first place, which is kind of the point. Well, that went on for a bit, didn't it? Sam Signorelli asks, how have carrier launch and recovery procedures changed over the years from HMS Argus to the end of the period the channel covers? As power plants have changed from pistons to jets and planes have gotten larger and more complex, things like pre-flight acts and hand signals have changed, but it'd be interesting to find out how. So landing procedures haven't changed a huge amount, mostly because aircraft landing hasn't changed a huge amount, but how they land, potentially, the mechanisms on the deck have changed a bit. So arrestor wires were a pretty early invention, but if the deck was completely clear, in theory, a lot of the earlier aircraft on carriers could actually land without arrestor wires. It's just that arrestor wires made it much easier because you could just wheel the aircraft then straight to an elevator to take it down, as opposed to having to chase it down an indeterminate length of deck and then haul it back. Plus also brake failures, shallow landings, slightly over revving, etc. could all end up with you going over the nose. And, well, additionally, it encourages you to land at a very specific location, it basically makes everything a lot more reliable. As aircraft get bigger and heavier and faster, they become a necessity. The other thing, of course, is that arrestor wires allow you, especially when you're talking about the period the channel covers, they allow you to theoretically operate aircraft undertaking flight ops, i.e. taking off, at the same time that you're recovering aircraft at the other end of the carrier, which obviously is, in theory, a good thing. That also affects what kind of facilities you need to stop aircraft that overrun your arrestor wires. Because, again, back in the day, when you're talking about early canvas and wood biplanes, a simple net might suffice, and that could bring the aircraft to a relatively gentle stop with relatively minimal damage because it didn't weigh all that much. As aircraft get bigger and faster, the safety nets, safety barriers, safety wires, etc. become much more about just stopping that aircraft before it hits the island or before it hits aircraft up front. And you're pretty much accepting that aircraft's going to be at least heavily damaged, if not a write-off in most cases. Takeoffs have seen quite a lot of changes. This is obviously HMS Courageous, and as you can tell, she has the lower takeoff, the lower flight deck and the upper flight deck. This is a feature you'd also see in Glorious. This is a feature you'd see in Akagi, Kaga, and a few other carriers. Akagi and Kaga, for a very, very short moment of time, actually operating 3 flight decks, but only with the very, very lightest of aircraft on that middle flight deck. The idea of this, depending on which navy you're looking at, was basically to allow different types of aircraft, be they fighters or strike aircraft or whatever, to operate and launch simultaneously from different levels. The US got involved with the vague idea with catapult launches out the side, believe it or not. And that brings us on to another issue, which is catapult launchers. As aircraft got heavier and needed a greater takeoff run to actually get airborne, these kinds of multiple levels fell out of use because the shorter ones just weren't capable of being used, and even the longer ones offered reduced performance or limited the performance of the aircraft that you could put on them. So the single big long upper flight deck takes over. For the most of the time that there are carriers operating in the time the channel covers, catapults are a useful but secondary thing, partly because they're mostly gunpowder powered and they do exert a fair amount of stress on the airframes, partly because there are certain limits to them, and partly because they're, for the most part, not needed. The invention of the steam catapult, which becomes then the de facto method of catapulting increasingly heavier aircraft off of the decks, and has slightly more forgiving acceleration characteristics than the gunpowder catapult, although they did try flywheel and pneumatic ones as well, but they didn't last too long. The steam catapult was basically invented right at the end of the time period the channel covers, so really doesn't play into things all that much. The same thing with the angled flight deck, for that matter. And then, of course, that's before you get into landing systems, hand signals, as you mentioned. whether you stow each aircraft on landing or you just move it off to park it, and all sorts of other factors that could probably be an entire Wednesday video in themselves. Manani Wanderer asks, what warship from 1900 on that has been mostly forgotten by history do you feel most deserves to be remembered? There's a whole slew of ships from 1900 onwards that I think deserve a lot more attention than they usually get. And much like my favourite ship, who sits at the very top spot and who sits in the top three kind of operate on a rotating basis, largely depending on how I'm feeling on the day and which accounts I've read most recently. But at the moment, if someone was to just say to me in a pub, okay, Drac, tell us about a ship that we've probably not heard about at all or in much detail, but you think we really should, I would nominate the Abdiel class mine layers, one of which you can see here. This is Manxman. Purely because they are absolutely hilarious little ships. They're not that much more heavily armed than your average destroyer. In fact, there are a number of destroyers that outgun them, despite the fact they are considerably larger. I mean, they're about the size... They're the size of a large super destroyer as far as displacement goes. But their biggest gun is a 4-inch. Admittedly, they've got a few of them. They've got 6 of them, but still, it's not the world's heaviest armament for something of that scale. But of course, they are designed as mine layers, and they are hilariously fast. Now, admittedly, some of the French contre-torpilliers are even faster, but for ships that actually fought through the majority of World War II, they are hilariously fast, especially as for their size. And they spend their war doing lots of interesting little things. Yes, they do a bit of mine laying, but because of their combination of speed and, relatively speaking, large size for their overall hull class, they end up getting used for all sorts of funny things. They end up being supply ships, troop transports, getting around mines, which is hilarious for a minesweeper itself, disguised as enemy warships. And also, because they are so useful, they actually continue on in service for quite a while after World War II. For ships that are actually, for the most part of the class, launched in 1940, the ones that survive tend to end up sticking around in the Royal Navy until the mid-60s, and in the case of Manxman, the early 70s, which is quite good running for a World War II vintage warship in Royal Navy service. And they will continue to pull off various weird and wonderful activities that their relatively unique status allows them to, like trolling the US ships in the Mediterranean during the Suez Crisis by just blitzing past with them on the way to Egypt. So, yeah, they're kind of a, we were designed for this thing, but we're going to promptly do anything but that thing ship, with a lot of hazards involved. And ironically enough, one of them, Abdiel, was sunk by mines. So, yeah, that would be my candidate at the moment. Jim Smitty asks, why did the US Navy assume the older standards would no longer be part of the fleet by 44-45? I understand by that point they wouldn't be frontline combat units, but surely some of them could serve in second-line duties. Convoy escort is something for the 14-inch gun ships. Naval gunfire support is also something they'd be perfect for, as 12 or 14-inch high-explosive shells to the Japanese would be most welcome by the Marines. So why not just stick them in reserves as the fast battleships are commissioned, and then return them to active duty service when war comes around? Or were they still following the London Naval Treaty limitations that limited them to 15 capital ships? Or was Congress just being cheap? Well, initially, when they're starting the fast battleship program with the North Carolinas and so forth, there is still the treaty system in place, which effectively is compelling them to replace the older ships with the new. So that's part of it, and obviously when they're drawing up their initial plans, they're assuming that treaty system and peace will continue, at which point, as newer, better fast battleships come along, older, slower, standard types have to go. The Royal Navy was doing pretty much the same thing. It's one of the reasons why they started the modernizations and upgrades with the QEs, because they reckoned initially that the King George V's would replace the R's, and so given that by the time Warspite comes out of refit, King George V is just starting construction, And by the time Queen Elizabeth and Valiant are out of modernisation, King George V is closer to completion than she is to being started. The Royal Navy sat down and went, well, if the King George V are replacing the R's, why would we put R class in a 2 to 3 year modernisation only for it to come out at the other end and be replaced within a year or two? Whereas with Queen Elizabeth looking like they were going to be replaced with the Lions, which they thought were probably coming into service in 42, 43-ish, and obviously never did, but probably would have been slightly later still. Then having Warspite come in 37, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in 39, and then in theory, if everything had continued on, Barham and Malaya perhaps in 40 or 41, along with Hood and Repulse, that would give the QEs 5 to 8 additional years in service before they also replaced. Anyway, back to the US, there's a similar logic in play. They were planning on modernising the Big Five, so the Colorados and the Tennessees, but everything else they thought was going to be replaced quite quickly. So New York, Texas, Arkansas, the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas would then replace Arizona, Pennsylvania, and some of the New Mexicos, possibly all of them, etc., etc., etc. And even once the treaty system began to break down, the other problem you face is that if and when the treaty system breaks down, ships get even bigger, even faster, even more heavily armoured, which means that the frontline days of the standards are well and truly over. Not a chance. And these new, bigger ships cost more to run, both in terms of manpower and in terms of money. And in peacetime, the Navy doesn't have infinite money, nor does it have infinite men. So again, assuming that wartime is not going to come upon them, which obviously is the thinking right up until wartime actually comes upon them in the shape of a bunch of Japanese strike aircraft, there's no point in really keeping the ships in reserve, because mechanically they have reached pretty much the end of their lives. There's a reason why pretty much all the old battleships go to the scrapyard very quickly, unless, like Texas, they get turned into museums. They've been around since the early 1910s. Yes, they've had machinery refits, but as I've said before, the average life expectancy of the machinery was about 20 years, give or take. And if we take a median age of them coming to service in the latter part of the 1910s, then that machinery lifetime expiration date is coming up in the latter part of the 1930s. Now, some careful management, some updates, refits, in some cases a lot of machinery, especially boiler replacement in the case of something like Texas, and the fact that turboelectric drive is a little bit less wearing on machinery was pushing those dates out a little bit. But when those standards enter World War II, the time is ticking on their power plants, and by the end of the war, not only are they hopelessly obsolete as battleships, but in a lot of cases their machinery is within a year or two of just giving up entirely. And knowing all of this, it means that the US Navy really doesn't have, as long as they're thinking about peacetime being maintained, any role for the standards once the fast battleships come into play. The Big Five would be kind of like the QEs and the battle cruisers in the Royal Navy. They'd be modernised and kept around until whatever was supposed to replace them came in. So in theory you would have, although obviously they didn't know it at the time, but in theory you would have the North Carolinas, South Dakotas and Iowas, so that's making up 10 ships, and then the Montana class would actually round the fleet out to pretty much its same numerical size. So the 5 Montanas and would replace the Big Five once the Montanas are completed. Similarly, the Lions would have replaced the QEs, and whatever was going to succeed the Lions in a peaceful timeline would have replaced Hood, Renown, and Repulse. Possibly Vanguard and her children or successors would have replaced Hood, Renown, and Repulse. And then the Lion successors would have replaced Rodney and Nelson. But in any case, that's basically what the US was thinking. Reichspeer Minister asks, what is, if there even was one, the counterpart to the Shinano in the Allied navies, and how do they compare in fighting capability? Was the conversion, if done, actually worth it? So there's no direct counterpart to Shinano, as in giant battleship hull converted into an aircraft carrier or indeed a support carrier. If you want to look at battleships or battle cruisers converted into carriers on the Allied side, you basically have to go back to the Lexingtons, Courageous, Glorious, Eagle, that sort of thing, at the beginning of carrier design and build. Everyone, the British and Americans, they just build their own dedicated carriers afterwards. I mean, Béarn is also a conversion, but again, the French were building Joffre, so even the French weren't doing conversions either. What else have you got on the Allied side? I suppose, well, if you want to look at support carrier, you have Unicorn, but Unicorn was designed as such from the ground up. She's not a conversion. So the closest you're going to get to giant converted battleship hull in the late 1930s - early 1940s would be what you can see on screen at the moment. The proposed design study into either converting an Iowa class into a carrier or possibly completing Kentucky and or Illinois as carriers. And it didn't go anywhere because they looked at it and they reckoned that capability-wise you'd get something that was slightly less capable than an Essex, but would cost more than an Essex. So why bother doing that when you can just build more Essexes? Coneled asks, generally magazine explosions tend to have adverse impacts on the structural integrity of the vessel to which they occur. How many, if any, warships have survived the explosion of their primary magazine, with survived being defined as either continuing to exist and able to be repaired or salvaged, or B, able to proceed to a repair facility under their own power? Yeah, as you might imagine, shockingly, most ships that have full explosions of one or more magazines, they aren't usually long for this world. However, believe it or not, there are a few ships that do survive magazine explosions and magazine fires. The number of those, by far the majority, survive magazine fires, which is somewhat more understandable because obviously before the fire can actually spread and set off enough explosives to cause a really big boom, then you still have a chance. But there are also ships that have actually had the magazine, or a magazine at least, partially or fully cook off and met one of the two criteria in the question. Two examples from World War II would be the ship you can see in the picture, USS Boise. So she was hit by a Japanese shell, and if you've been watching the Guadalcanal series, you'll know that the Japanese shells, the AP shells, were actually optimized for underwater travel. And in this particular case, one of the few cases where we can point to a Japanese shell and say, yes, this was definitively a benefit for them, because an 8-inch shell landed a little bit short, went underwater, obviously utilizing its specialized profiling, punched through the side of Boise, went into one of the forward magazines and set it on fire, and the magazine partially detonated. I say partially because if you look at the magazine layout for a Brooklyn-class cruiser, if the magazine is left to detonate completely uncontrolled, it's going to spread to the other two, and then the front of the ship is disappearing. As you may notice, the front of USS Boise is still very much there, for the most part, and this is because the diving shell was a little bit of a self-extinguishing prophecy in this particular case. Because the shell impact went directly to the magazines, it meant that whilst the magazines were in the process of burning, deflagrating, and exploding, a whole ton of seawater came in behind through the hole the shell had just made and put it all out. So Boise was able to survive partially thanks to that, and partially also thanks to the fact that the actual US propellant that they used in their main guns, whilst it would explode if you set fire to enough of it in a confined space, it did tend to deflagrate a little bit first in small quantities before it went kaboom, as opposed to something like cordite, which will go kaboom even in single charge mode. Although you can burn cordite in a completely open environment, but that's neither here nor there. Another example, perhaps a bit more extreme, would be the Russian battleship Petropavlovsk, or Marat, or whatever it was going by at the time, but originally Petropavlovsk, and that's a Gangut class. It was bombed by the Luftwaffe during the German advance, and its forward magazine exploded. Remember, the Ganguts have 4 distinct separate turrets with 4 distinct separate magazines. So the forward magazine blew up, basically destroyed the bow of the ship, very much like the way that Arizona was destroyed. But partly because of the spread out nature, obviously the explosion was not quite as volatile, because rather than being 1,000 pounds of gunpowder plus the contents of 2 full 14-inch magazines, which are designed to each serve a triple turret, it was the contents of the magazine that served a single triple 12-inch rather than 6 14-inch guns plus the gunpowder. So whilst the bow of the ship was destroyed, everything from the superstructure aft settled, and the Russians then turned around and salvaged the thing and basically used it as a floating dash, sitting on the riverbed dash seabed a little bit, gun battery with the other 3 turrets in question. So it continued to exist and was able to be utilised for further things, whereas Boise, as you can see, was able to return under her own power to get repaired. Alternate historian Turtle Duck asks, if you have time, listen to the song The Devil's Reach by the Jolly Roger. After listening to the song, is it at all accurate? Could a ship which had 47 cannons and the deck had 14 guns take on 5 gunships in a bay at night, sinking all 5 but being forced to beach herself? Well, I listened to the song, and actually it is surprisingly spot on for the kind of scenario it describes in the Age of Sail. So a ship with 47 cannons, 47 is a slightly odd number. It suggests maybe there's a fixed bow chaser that's big enough to be counted within the ship's gunnery, because obviously normally gun decks are symmetrical and 47 is an odd number. But nonetheless, 47 cannon and the deck with 14 guns, again, suggests that whoever was writing this song had a very good awareness of how ships were rated and counted back then, because obviously the upper deck, as we've covered before, if you have guns in positions which the ship has not been pierced for, they aren't counted. Hence why USS Constitution, for instance, is rated at a certain number of guns, but usually was carrying 10 to 20 more of them, because those were upper deck carronades for the most part. Now, from the description, a 46, 47, 48 gunner is at the absolute low end of a 4th rate. But a 4th rate is the smallest ship of the line for a long period of time before frigates start to overtake it, and bearing in mind that this is presumably set at the height of the piratical age or somewhere close to it, it's definitely going to count as a small ship of the line. And the fact it has another 14 guns on top of that, so it's actually carrying 61 guns, that puts it at, assuming that these guns have a substantial weight to them, right at the top end of being a 4th rate, and really, within touching distance of being a very, very small 3rd. But one would presume the main gun deck is probably 18-pounders. Now, gunship is in and of itself not a specifically Age of Sail term. There are gunboats, but boats are somewhat smaller than ships. But the use of the term gunship would, at least to my mind, imply a non-rated vessel. The fact they're also out there to collect a bounty would suggest that perhaps they're privateers. So a privateering gunship, whilst not a common statement, is a statement that does occasionally crop up in that time period. At which point, if you look at your typical privateers, well, they're normal privateers. Their gun armament tends to range up somewhere from the low 10s to the low 20s. So some of the bigger privateers could have ships that were at least armed to roughly the manner of a very small 6th rate. There were very, very few privateers who had even bigger ships, but that's not very common. So if we assume that each of the gunships has, say, 16 to 18 guns, which would be about mid-tier for a privateer, then that would suggest that the 5 gunships that are present would possess somewhere between 80 and 90 guns total. So in terms of number of guns, they actually outgun the Devil's Reach by a factor of 50%. However, a privateer would typically be carrying 8-9 pounders, maybe 12 pounders. Very, very rarely would you find a privateer with 18 pounders, usually 12s. And if we assume that the Devil's Reach is armed in a manner that's similar to what it's suggesting, so perhaps it's got 18 pounders or 24 pounders on the main gun deck, probably given the time period 18s, then probably 12s on its upper gun deck. This is a fourth rate in the picture, by the way, to give you some idea. And then maybe it'll be a bit early in the heydays of piracy for a carronade, but if the time period is moved forward a little bit, and we just adjust for the fact it's fiction, maybe it's got some 24-pounder carronades, so it's got 14 24-pounder carronades on the upper deck. The actual throw weight of the Devil's Reach would be a lot closer. In fact, regardless of whether the lower gun deck is 18 or 24 pounders, it would actually outgun in throw weight the 5 gunships. So, yeah, if assuming the 5 gunships are all carrying roughly 12 pounders, if the Devil's Reach is carrying 18 pounders and then 12 pounders and then 24-pound carronades, its broadside weight would be, okay, maybe only a dozen or so pounds more, but it would still be just that little bit more. And if it's carrying 24 pounders, it's actually almost 100 pounds of broadside throw weight heavier. Plus, there's another advantage. As long as there's enough crew aboard the Devil's Reach, then you've got the fact that the Devil's Reach can obviously engage with both sides. So it's going to be throwing between 1,000 and 1,200, depending on the weight of the lower deck guns. Between 1,000 and 1,200 pounds of shot per broadside, which means it's actually, in that engagement, assuming the gunships are fighting from all sides, which it says they are surrounding it, the gunships are actually severely outnumbered. Or they're outshot weighted. So there'll be individually more cannon shot coming in from the gunships, but the actual overall broadside weight is in favour of the Devil's Reach. At which point, taking on what's effectively a small ship of the line in 5 large but not quite rated vessels, or possibly very, 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 very low 6th rate equivalents, that is actually exactly the kind of fight where you would expect something like the Devil's Reach to be able to completely lay into the gunboats, or gunships, I should say, wipe them out. That's certainly a realistic thing. But just the sheer weight of fire might well leave the Devil's Reach in a sinking condition. So actually, congratulations to whoever wrote that song, because not only have they provided a very realistic scenario, but they've also had the outcome pretty much in line with what I would imagine. Robin McFarlane asks, there seem to have been a lot of accidents with muzzle-loading guns being double-loaded. How could this happen, as the gunners must have noticed that the gun had not recoiled after, or there was no smoke after it was fired? Well, it depends on the type of double loading that's occurred. In the heat of battle, bearing in mind you've got a fuse or priming powder, or a flintlock, depending on the era of the cannon that you're talking about for cannons, then in the heat of battle, if everybody, close their eyes, cover their ears, turned away, and out of the peripheral vision there's the flash of the initial priming powder going off, you're going to assume the thing's fired, and there'll be so many other guns going off around you that the fact that your particular gun may or may not have actually fired is probably going to be lost on you, which explains part of it. When you're talking about later guns, not getting the recoil on them or getting only a partial discharge could be a problem, but that's why when you're talking about later muzzle loaders, i.e. later muzzle loading shell guns, the problem of double loading them in battle doesn't really come up so much as it does with cannon. But you do get things like you see here with HMS Thunderer, where you do get peacetime double loading accidents and everything goes up. And in those cases, it's not that they thought Thunderer's gun had fired, although it's a possibility, because this is the other thing, when you get guns this big, you have automatic recoil mechanisms. So Thunderer's guns fire, the recoil mechanisms do their thing, the guns end up in roughly the same position as they did before, or in some other fixed position, ready to reload. You might assume that therefore the guns have actually fired, because again, you're not going to be looking directly at them, or listening, particularly without desperately trying to cover your ears. But if you have a discharge that has failed to occur in a peacetime incident, or you just someone's forgotten that the gun was loaded, then you just literally end up double loading, as you can see in this diagram, and then, well, bad things tend to happen to the guns. So yeah, it's basically a case of peacetime you can forget that that it's already been loaded, and with a muzzle loading weapon it's much harder to check, as opposed to with a breech loader. You open it up saying, oh yeah, there's a round in there, or more particularly you can see the base of the charge. And with cannon there's just so much going on, it's entirely possible that you just miss it. Duke of Petchington asks, I once had a discussion with Dr. Clark about the 4.7-inch L45, either the Mark 9 or the Mark 12, basically the one with the sliding breech block. I wondered, if the Royal Navy had developed the 4.7-inch to be dual-purpose, would it fit in the same between-deck mounts as housed the 4.5-inch with no change, and if a 4.7-inch L45 between-deck mount could be mounted on the Tribal-class destroyers? I don't know about no change, because the 4.7-inch L45, for obvious reasons, has a slightly longer barrel than the 4.5-inch L45, specifically about 12, I think it's about 12 inches longer. So you would have to make some, is it 10? I thought we were thinking maybe 10 inches longer. Anyway, it's a bit of a longer barrel, so the balance points are going to be slightly different. You are going to have to make some adjustments to the mounting. But if you look at the rest of it, you know, gun weight, projectile weight, etc., you could probably get a dual-purpose 4.7-inch in roughly into a 4.5-inch between-deck mount without too many major modifications. The biggest one is going to be where the balance point of the gun is, because of the additional length, and it is obviously slightly heavier. It's about, you're talking about another 400 kilos, I think, per gun. So the mounting may need a bit of strengthening as well. But in terms of the muzzle energy, it's fairly similar. And as I said, in terms of the shell weight, obviously you need to increase the size of the hoist a little bit, and it's a between-deck mount rather than a upon-deck mount, which means that whatever's underneath is, on the level underneath in the Tribals, is going to have to be shuffled around or made way from. The biggest problem you're going to have is weight, because even if you go with the manually operated, either not remote power controlled, Mark II between deck mount, which is the mount that you'll find on Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Renown, and the Illustrious class, for example, so the Happy Pancakes, as I like to call them, that is going to be considerably heavier than the CP19 mounting, which is only 25 tons, which is what's on the Tribals, whereas you're looking at just over 38.5 tons for the 4.5. And obviously if that goes up a little bit more, because you've got almost a ton more weight in gun, if you're on a twin mounting, then you would potentially be trading weight-wise. If you would have to trade in one of your mounts, so you'd have 3 twin fully dual-purpose 4.7s using between-deck mounts, and you'd still be about 20 tons overweight compared to the 4 twin 4.7s, which the Tribals historically had, which is a fair bit, to be perfectly frank, for a destroyer. Now, you could, in theory, use the 4.5-inch between-deck mount as found on HMS Ark Royal. That's only 30 tons, and then plus the weight of the additional weight of the 4.7's third might be about 31 tons. So you'd be looking at about 20, just over 20 tons overweight if you replaced all 4, or maybe about 5 tons underweight if you replaced just 3. So you could get slightly underweight with 3 dual-purpose 4.7s using Arc Royals between deck, or go about the same amount overweight if you used 4 twins, as opposed to using 3 twins from the Happy Pancake mountings. So weight-wise, yeah, in theory you could mount some variant on the tribal class. The main thing is going to be, if it's, as I said before, if it's a between-deck mount, what you're going to do with all the stuff that's a deck below on the tribal historically. 22NF2 asks, would it be fair to say that the X factor that ultimately led to the sinking of Bismarck and Prince of Wales was an aerial torpedo to the rudder? Consequently, did major navies realise this and adapt their tactics accordingly to make rudder torpedo hits a lot more difficult for aircraft? Well, with Prince of Wales, it wasn't so much a hit on the rudder, it was the damage to one of the prop shafts that really did her in. The rudder was something of an irrelevance once they restarted that damaged prop shaft and opened up the entire stern. But nonetheless, I think the general point of hits to the stern, which mess up either your steering or your propulsion or both, yes, that would be kind of the thing that ultimately kills both. Because if Prince of Wales hadn't taken that hit aft, as we know, and as I've said before, the one time her actual torpedo defense system was hit, the torpedo defense system coped with the incoming warhead pretty well. Now, she was hit a couple of other times outside her torpedo defense systems, including aft, so that may not ultimately have helped. But if she was capable of maneuvering and just staying at a high speed because of not taking that one hit, then it's possible she might have actually been able to survive, and maybe even Repulse would have survived, because if Prince of Wales is still a very much active moving target and engaging with what elements of our anti-aircraft defense systems are working, then they may not have been able to attack Repulse in exactly the way that Repulse was finally fatally hit. And, it doesn't mean you have to break up the entire attack, you just have to break up one side, because up until that point, when you're just attacking Repulse down a single vector, Repulse have proven exceptionally good at dodging that. So, it's possible. With Bismarck, it's, I'd say very definitely the case, because if Bismarck had managed to maintain her course and speed at the rate that she was when she was attacked by Ark Royal Swordfish, then she probably would have gotten under Luftwaffe air cover. Well, she certainly would have gotten under Luftwaffe air cover before she was caught again. Whether the Luftwaffe would have actually sent aircraft out to the right location in time to save her if she was still tracked down by the British ships is a slightly different matter, because of course she does have to run the gauntlet of the Tribals and Piron, so they might have got a hit on her overnight. Plus, if Bismarck wasn't crippled, then it's possible that Ark Royal would have just kept launching airstrikes until she was. But for the precise sequence of events that killed Bismarck, then, yeah, the hit to the rudder was pretty much the turning point. Now, as far as what navies could do, there is a limited amount. You can't really put armour or other kinds of defences on or around the propellers or the rudder. They have to be exposed to the water in order to actually do their job, and that means that if torpedo is coming into the stern, they are pretty much in the line of fire. You could, I suppose, put some skegs on the outer shafts, the way that some of the US fast battleships did. That might work, but that's only going to be a very slight mitigation factor. It's not, and especially for a rudder, it's not going to make the blindest bit of difference. In terms of adapting tactics, well, again, tactics are against aircraft. You could say they generally change their tactics by sticking a ton of more anti-aircraft weapons on, but that's not specifically to do with rudder hits. The main thing to avoid this, although it has to be said, there's not a particular indication they specifically adopted these tactics to avoid rudder hits, would be to try and turn into the attack when it comes to aircraft, because of course, if you turn away from or towards an attack, you narrow down your profile, which makes you harder to hit. And also the bow, if you turn into the attack, I mean, it's not great to take a torpedo hit to the bow, but of all the areas of the ship to have flooding induced, the bow is probably the less vital one, because there's not as much buoyancy in the bow, so you don't lose as much when it's flooded. Now, obviously, like with Prince of Wales shell hit to Bismarck's bow, that can massively reduce your speed if you want to prevent the flooding spreading, but you can still largely remain operational. Whereas if you take a hit amidships that does manage to breach your torpedo defense system, not only will you have probably a list going on, but there's an awful lot more potential buoyancy to be lost there. And of course, the stern is the bit we've just said we don't want to be hit because of all the delicate stuff that's there. And also, if you turn into an aerial torpedo attack, it increases the closing distance, which makes it a little bit harder for the aircraft to calculate exactly when it should be dropping, especially in the era where they're having to drop low and slow, so maybe not so much towards the end of the war with Avengers and so forth. But that's just also, again, more generally a way of avoiding incoming torpedo attacks. And of course, aircraft would try and take advantage of their much greater speed if they saw you maneuvering in that way to just to go around you and still drop a torpedo that would roughly hit your side. So unfortunately, whilst there's a limited amount you can do, especially if you're a smaller vessel, but then if you're a smaller vessel, a torpedo hit pretty much anywhere might total you, there's nothing really specific that you can do to avoid stern hits. Martin Ludens asks, you've already talked at length about the failures of the US Navy's Mark 14 torpedo, but what about its bigger brother, the Mark 15 surface-launched torpedo? How aware was the destroyer branch of the US Navy about the problems that were plaguing the submarine torpedoes, and how long did it take them to realise that their own torpedoes were similarly affected? And did Bjord fix the Mark 15 alongside the Mark 14, or was there additional prodding needed to get that sorted? The US destroyers were aware to a certain degree, because of course the submarine crews and the destroyer crews would talk when they were ashore. But although the Mark 15 had a lot of the same problems as the Mark 14, because essentially they shared a common design lineage, the Mark 15 was just a little bit bigger with a bit more boom in it. For example, I had the Mark 6 exploder, and the Mark 6 exploder's problems were not going to be any different on a Mark 14 as a Mark 15. At the same time, there were two factors that made it a little bit more complex of an issue when it came to the surface launch torpedoes. Firstly, of course, US destroyers didn't engage the enemy quite as often at least in the surface enemies, quite as often per deployment as submarines did, because of course a submarine's entire job was to go out, find an enemy ship, and shoot torpedoes at it. A destroyer's job very often could be supply, escort, anti-aircraft cover, etc., none of which might involve tangling with an enemy warship, and when they did tangle with an enemy warship, more often than not, they would end up using their guns against the enemy warship as much or instead of the torpedoes. And so the number of destroyer versus surface ship torpedo engagements is much lower, which means you have a smaller pool of results to draw on. So if a destroyer's been deployed and maybe after 6 months it may have shot at the enemy aircraft a lot with its guns, may have taken a few pot shots at enemy surface vessels with its guns, but have never launched its torpedoes, they're not going to know that they have a problem with their torpedoes. Another thing is that even when you do get a chance to launch your torpedoes, whereas on a submarine, normally you launch your torpedoes at fairly close range and under what you hope is a stealthy approach, so you have a good idea of when those torpedoes should hit, and you can even be listening to it for it on hydrophones, you might even be watching it through a periscope. With destroyer-based torpedoes, very often you ripple off a bunch of torpedoes, and then the next thing you're doing is turning and manoeuvring out of dodge, because whoever you've launched torpedoes at is presumably going to be a bit miffed with you. Which means that your observations of whether or not your torpedoes hit at all are a little bit compromised, and because a lot of the time your enemies could be perhaps a little bit more aware that you have launched torpedoes at them, they are going to be manoeuvring, and you're probably going to be in a warship versus warship situation, which means they're faster anyway, so you're not going to expect as many hits. So if a submarine stalks a merchant ship going at 12 knots, very carefully and deliberately sets up its spread and volleys off 6 torpedoes, and is sitting there listening to them track, counting them down on the timer, hears a couple of thuds and 4 misses, then they know something's gone wrong with at least those 2 torpedoes, or if they're watching through a periscope, they're C3 prematures or something like that. Whereas with a destroyer, if you're sneaking up on an enemy cruiser and the enemy cruiser realizes it's under attack, you drop off 4 or 5 torpedoes, turn, run, and start fighting with your guns. The enemy cruiser speeds up and starts maneuvering. The fact that you don't see any visible torpedo explosions may not necessarily be a massive surprise to you, even if in reality perhaps you did score a couple of hits, but they just went thonk against the ship. So the US destroyers processing that, yes, they did have a major problem with their torpedoes, the same as the Mark 14s, wasn't quite as rapid an uptake, perhaps, as it was with the submarines. However, the good news is that because the Mark 14 and the Mark 15 are so similar, the fixes applied to the Mark 14 also solve most of the problems, not necessarily all, but most of the problems with the Mark 15. So when someone says, when the correct admiral say, well, the Mark 6 exploder has a problem with its magnetic detonator, just switch it over to contact only. Well, that applies to every torpedo with a Mark 6 exploder, so that includes the Mark 15s. And then when somebody turns around and says, well, the contact exploder still is not particularly brilliant because the firing pin's a bit dodgy, but hey, we've invented this new firing pin modification, so that'll fix that. We should apply this to all torpedoes with a Mark 6 exploder. It applies equally to the US surface vessels as it does the submarines, and so on and so forth. John McDonough asks, with the finding of the Montevideo Maru, I was wondering about the history of the prison ship. Who started the practice? The British seem to have raised it to a fine art, with the use of them becoming so common it became a literary trope in the Georgian and Victorian period. I can't believe that they were the first to come up with the idea, though. The economics of the practice seems so self-evident, I guess it stretches far back into antiquity. But does it? Well, in terms of sort of the linear descent, yeah, the British use of prison hulks in the starting sort of the 1700s is pretty much the start of the ongoing process. And this is one of the things you'll find a lot with various things, whether it be prison ships, submarines, and other kinds of naval developments. You can usually point to a lot of individual times such a concept has been come up with, but then it either doesn't go anywhere or it just kind of fades out of view into obscurity after a while until someone else reinvents it, 50, 100 years later, and so on and so forth. So unless one of those achieves something particularly notable, what we usually end up doing is referring to the person or invention of a vehicle or vessel or system that actually sticks and carries on as the first, the invention, the beginning of, etc., etc., even though there may have been earlier versions thereof that just never caught on for whatever reason beforehand. Anyway, the main reason you don't see any particularly significant use of prison ships before that period is less to do with the fact that, well, old ship moored in the middle of the water is actually a relatively good place to store people. You don't want to go anywhere fast. It's actually more to do with the fact that prior to approximately that period, you didn't have any significant numbers of people you actually wanted incarcerated for particularly prolonged periods of time. Part of the deployment of prison ships in the UK was to deal with prisoners of war, but also with the growing regular prison population. And a good chunk of why those populations were increasing was because it was increasingly being seen that confinement in and of itself could be used as a punishment against criminals. Prior to that, whether you look at the Tudor period, the medieval period, the Anglo-Saxon period, the Roman period, or whatever, ancient Greek, Egypt, etc., whilst there were small numbers of prisons for very specific types of criminals, the vast majority of punishments were either fines, physical punishments, whipping, scourging, chopping limbs off, or everything up down to outright execution, or things like forced labour, being sold into slavery, or some other similar imposition, but basically something which was relatively self-sustaining or paid for itself, or didn't incur the state too much cost. Because if you keep someone imprisoned, you have to pay for the upkeep of the prison, you also have to pay for the upkeep of the prisoner, and if you start holding lots and lots of people, that starts getting rather expensive. And of course, if you're holding someone prisoner, they can't earn money, so trying to charge them for their own accommodation will only get you so far. And thus, as I said, whilst there were a small number of prisons attested to pretty much throughout recorded history, there just wasn't the prison population that would then necessitate a relatively cheap, easy offshore person storage method. But then in the 17th, well, very late 17th, then getting into the 18th centuries, suddenly a combination, as I said, of changes in the legal system plus wartime prison population, wartime captive populations meant that prison populations grew significantly, and thus the prison ship came about. Marlin Stout asks, you mentioned before that Rodney may or may not have hit Bismarck with a torpedo and thus possibly became the only capital ship to torpedo another capital ship successfully. Given that torpedo tubes were present on most pre-World War I capital ships, are there any instances where a capital ship managed to successfully torpedo another ship of any type in combat? Or was the inclusion of torpedo tubes on these units just a colossal waste of space and weight? If you define a capital ship as a battleship, as opposed to the use of armoured cruisers in the battle line and so forth, I think Rodney remains the only battleship to successfully torpedo another vessel. There are plenty of engagements where battleships fired torpedoes at other vessels, whether they be other battleships or various other bits and pieces. But in terms of full-on straight-up battle, from the time that battleships started carrying torpedo launchers to when they were taken out, and/or they stopped using them, I think Rodney's pretty much the only one that actually hit anything. Now, I'm sure there may be something in the latter Victorian period where, some account that virtually nobody's ever heard of, but I still doubt it myself. Now, was the inclusion of torpedo tubes on these units just a colossal waste of space and weight? You could make a decent argument that after about 1910-ish, or maybe even the start of the Dreadnought race, then maybe. Because at that stage, the gun ranges had gone way beyond the torpedo ranges. And we're talking about not just absolute gun ranges, but just the effective battle ranges were way beyond the range of conventional torpedoes. The inclusion of torpedoes on battleships, of course, having been done when actually the effective range even of early torpedoes, once you got past the very first Whiteheads, was actually comparable to or in excess of the ranges at which you would actually engage in gunfire. So if you're talking about the Spanish-American War period, you can make a very solid case for why battleships should have torpedoes. They'd be just as capable of using them as anything else at an expected range. So you look at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, a decent range torpedo shot could have been made, or the Battle of Manila Bay even more so. Decent range torpedo shots could be made at pretty much the same ranges that they were actually engaging with gunfire at. But once you get to, engagements of 10, 12, 15,000 yards being the expected, which, okay, Tsushima's not quite that, but by, the middle part of the 1900s, like 97, 1908, etc., most people are fairly sensible about battle ranges now being in the 5-figure distances, at which point your torpedo's not really going to matter. So you could probably say that at that point they start to become a waste of space and weight. Albeit, obviously, then hilariously, the one hit that actually occurs is many, 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 many years after that. Although, weirdly, that also means that theoretically you could make an argument that the Japanese should have reintroduced torpedo tubes into their capital ships in the late 1930s, because once they developed the Long Lance, if you could get a Long Lance launcher into a battleship, that actually does have the range to be a practical weapon, at least on paper, in a battle line engagement, because if the fight starts out at 25,000 yards and closes down to below 20,000 yards, which, most battleship actions, limited as they are in World War II, do occur at, for the majority of their gunfire exchange, below 20,000 yards. The Long Lance is capable of reaching out that far. And the last thing anyone's going to expect is to be torpedoed at, 18,000 yards by a Japanese battleship. Matt Blom asks, taking you back to the very beginning of the time frame the channel covers, in your opinion, what was the first true warship in history where the ship was designed specifically for naval combat? And do historians happen to debate which ship this is, or is it a clear-cut matter? It is still something of a matter of debate, but that is not so much because of a lack of evidence. We do not have a huge amount of evidence, but it's not a debate around the evidence that we do have. It's more a debate about what do you consider to be the definition of a true warship, because, broadly speaking, and there are obviously lots of iterations below this, but broadly speaking, you can divide up the arguments into two things. One would be a ship that is designed in and of itself for war as a weapon, which, if you go back really far into ancient history, basically means it has a ram of some description on the bow. For those, you have to go back to maybe around, as far as I'm aware, 800 or 900 BC is when you start to definitively be able to point to things and go, right, this is where we can see clear, coherent evidence of ships equipped with rams and that this is an ongoing thing. However, if you want to go back further than that and describe a warship as a ship which has had specific design considerations built into it for conflict, armed conflict, as opposed to a merchant vessel, which may therefore look different because of their different design considerations, then it goes back a heck of a lot further. Theoretically, if you interpret certain paintings and carved artifacts, you can even go back as far as 3000 BC, and you can interpolate that what you might later call a galley or some kind of actively war-purposed vessel is in use. Now, it is a little bit of a stretch because the scenes of naval combat there are obviously they're relatively crudely rendered, but they do show a naval fight taking place. Although, as you might expect, naval combat in that period is more about two ships getting close enough to each other for the people on board to hit each other with swords and spears, with the occasional sling bolt or arrow being shot across if somebody thought to bring some range capability to the party. But as you progress from 3000 to maybe 2000 and then down to 1500 BC, you very definitely start to see ships depicted again in paintings and carvings and so forth that are lower lying, have far more oars, they're slimmer, etc., than contemporary, equally well depicted merchant and cargo vessels. Now, these are still basically just designed for the fast transport of troops. So very often you will see them and read about them in accounts being described to take a bunch of troops from point A to point B and land them. So they're almost like fast transports. But they also still get used in seaboard engagements, and obviously at that point they are of a form warships fighting other warships, because if you were going to just pick merchant ships up from your local traders and say, right, we're going to put men in these, they would visibly look and perform differently. And that's kind of covers things like the sea peoples as apart from anything else. So, yeah, I would say as I said earlier, it depends on your definition of what a warship is. If you want to define a warship as a ship that in and of itself is capable of delivering a blow separate from the people who are aboard it, just stabbing people, then you're probably looking at around 800 BC. If you want to look at, we can definitively prove that this is a ship whose design considerations are specifically fielded for military purposes, maybe up to 2000 BC. And if you want to argue that where can we see naval combat or combat occurring on the water depicted using ships which may or may not have been specifically built for the purpose, you can go back another 1,000 years still. Snowstalker36 asks, what happened to all the TBD Devastators that the Midway Museum needed a replica to display? I know most were lost in combat, but with operational and training losses adding to that, but it seems unbelievable that none survived to be replaced by the Avenger and pulled from duty for storage. Well, something you have to bear in mind is just how few Devastators there actually were. Around 130 or so were actually built. By the time you've got to not even quite World War II for the US, but World War II for everybody else, so late 1940, early 1941, you've already lost about 30 of them to operational accidents and other forms of damage and attrition. So going into the war, there's only about 100 or so Devastators total in existence. And then from that, obviously you have ongoing attrition, which is only going to get worse because the tempo of operations, including training, is higher during wartime. Then you have Coral Sea, where a couple of Devastators don't manage to recover back to ship properly, and then all of Lexington's complement go down with Lexington. So there's another at least a dozen TBDs off of the roster. Then you have Midway, where, the majority of all remaining operational Devastators are present at Midway, and half a dozen make it home. And then Yorktown goes down, which takes a third of the ones that made it back down with it. At which point you're now talking about less than 40 TBDs left in total in theatre. Those are then taken offline immediately. They're put in as training aircraft. So, of course, a training aircraft is going to suffer higher attrition than a frontline aircraft because the pilots are somewhat less experienced, at least outside of combat. So a bunch more are lost with that. They also decide that since they're pretty much useless as combat aircraft at this stage, they also use them for training at people who are learning how to put out aircraft fires. So a bunch of them get burned up in that way. And so pretty much by the end of, before the end of World War II even, every single one of the remaining Devastators has either crashed or been burned or been written off. And then I think there's maybe one or two left around after that, which then are just scrapped, because why would the US Navy, in the middle of a war when it has Avengers coming out of its ears, maintain one or two completely obsolete aircraft when they can just give those people an Avenger and go, even if you're going to use it as a transport in the continental United States, it's easier if you just replace it with an Avenger. And so by the end of the war, when you might think, oh, maybe we'll keep one for museum purposes, there aren't any, and there hadn't been any for over a year. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, in several previous videos you've discussed your assessment on the concept of battle carriers. How does this compare with the tactical assessment of such vessels by the navies that faced them at the time? Well, that assessment is slightly complicated by the fact that realistically you could only ever argue that there were 3 battle carriers in service, that being Issei Hyuga and, at a stretch, Megami. At which point the tactical assessment of all 3 really comes down to the US Navy, because they were the ones who mainly dealt with them and in most cases sank them. At which point, Tone and Shikima, some people would class as it, but Tone and Shikima are cruisers specifically configured for scouting. They were not actually designed to carry strike aircraft in any way, shape or form. But, the US tactical assessments of Megami basically amount to, first it was a 6-inch cruiser, then it was an 8-inch cruiser, then it was a slightly less powerful 8-inch cruiser, then it got essentially sunk as an incidental byproduct of blowing up Fuso and Yamashiro, so who cares? Issei and Hyuga, again, at the time that Issei and Hyuga even tried to be relevant as battle carriers, which was mostly serving as decoys in Ozawa's northern force. The US was more concerned with the other carriers in that force, and then afterwards, when they're just running as cargo ships. As far as I can tell, the US assessment of them was basically, cool, a weirdly shaped target. But the fundamental problem with this is that at the time that Issei Hyuga and Megami are in their guises as battle carriers, we're talking about the very end of World War II, at which point the US assessment of almost anything that the Japanese are putting out there in terms of shipping outside of their subs is, cool, target of some description. And the battle carriers are like, well, they're slightly easier to identify than most other ships, so yay. And Admiral Lee's assessment of Issei and Hyuga are the ones that got away, because after being told to press on north for so long by Halsey, when he's finally ordered to turn back, he's literally within 30 minutes of engaging Issei and Hyuga with, half the US fast battleship production, which would have been an interesting notch under those ships' belts. Paul Goyne asks, besides USS Monitor's inevitable defeat of HMS Warrior, what misconceptions, myths, or flat-out lies about naval history do you find most annoying? Well, we could be here all day, so I'll try and select a few from the major time periods as we step back through them. So for World War II, HMS Hood was poorly armoured, and HMS Hood was sunk because all of her ammunition handling was poor and there was no flash protection. Basically, lots of conjoined myths and lies that essentially equate some of the potential ways in which British battle cruisers were lost at Jutland, and somehow assume that A, Hood was in any way, shape or form similar to them, and B, that Hood somehow hadn't learned at all from something that happened over 20 years earlier. That it's more irritating just because it's so blatantly and patently ridiculous just on the face of it, let alone if you know even a modicum of naval history. And that's one of those mouth is engaged before brain moments, I think, with a lot of people. Kind of stemming from the same general Operation Rheinabung, the absolute obsession that some people have with insisting that practically anything German was unsinkable and only sank because it was scuttled. And I'm not even necessarily I'm not strictly referring to Bismarck here. I'm talking about just generally, if you look at almost any significant German vessel that was sunk at some point in World War II, and even a fair number of them that were sunk in World War One, obviously excluding Scapa Flow, which actually was definitively scuttling, and even with some of the smaller things like destroyers and U-boats, good grief, there's a very loud and very vocal, what I hope is a minority on the internet especially, who will absolutely insist until the cows come home that every single one of those things was scuttled. And I'm just sitting there going, hang on, no, hang on, wait a minute. When you look at Yorktown, Akagi, Kaga, Kirishima, etc., 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 what do we see recorded? Lexington, that matter. Who sank Lexington? Pretty much everyone will say the Japanese. Who sank Yorktown? The Japanese. Who sank Kaga? Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, Akagi. The Americans. You can kind of see the pattern here. The people who put absolutely massive amounts of firepower into the thing and let lots of water in the bottom and set lots of fires on the top and every so often cause massive explosions to occur on board are generally credited as being the ones who sank that vessel. And yet, in almost, if not all of the cases I just mentioned, those vessels were actually finished off by their own side, usually by torpedo. not necessarily every single one, but the majority of the ones I mentioned, which would be scuttling. External scuttling, but, scuttling nonetheless. And yet nobody lists them as scuttled except in the very technical sense. They just go, yeah, the other guy sank it. We might have had to finish it off, but whatever. The responsibility for the sinking rests with the other lot. And yet when it comes to German ships, there's this almost paranoid obsession with denying that the glorious Deutsche Kraft vessel could possibly ever be sent to the bottom by anything other than the willingness of its own crew to presumably dispose of it. And the last two, I think, from World War II would be Force Z proved that aircraft were now the dominant power. It's like, no, both before and after the sinking of Force Z, all major navies, and in particular with Force Z, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, faced significantly more intense, significantly larger, and significantly better organised attacks from bombers, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers on their ships without losing capital ships. Force Z proved if you have an unexpected attack by an elite anti-shipping trained unit against a pair of capital ships who have had half their anti-aircraft armament breakdown and have essentially, near as enough to make no difference, zero escort and are caught in the open, and you happen to get a couple of very, very lucky strikes in, then you can sink these capital ships. That's what Force Z proves. And there's a lot of other things associated with Force Z, like, the whole saying that Admiral Phillips was very scornful of having fighter opposition. And I mean, see my Force Z video for just how many myths and misconceptions there are around about that. The other big one from World War II, which really bugs me, is the whole Italians run away, Italians surrender, Italians useless memes. As you probably can tell from, the numerous interviews I've done with people like Vincent O'Hara, Italian military archives, and various other people, and what I've said myself as well. The Italian Navy was a clear and present threat to the Allies. The Italian Navy was, okay, at times some of their senior officers weren't exactly up to scratch, but point me to a single Navy where every single one of their senior officers was up to scratch in World War II. And, the Royal Navy committed a huge amount of resources to dealing with them. In some ways, at least in terms of the surface fleet, I would argue the Italian Navy was a much bigger threat than the Kriegsmarine in absolute terms, and the Royal Navy, in terms of resource deployment, certainly seems to have agreed. And yet somehow the terrible early to mid-war performance of the Italian army on land which, granted, the Italian army performance in North Africa is not as a whole something you really want to write home about, but somehow that seems to have translated almost without any real thought onto the Italian Navy. So that irritates me a lot. And since this has run on a bit longer than I thought, we'll just have to skip through a few other ones quickly. Another one, the idea that the Tegetthoffs were useless battleships. That's the Austro-Hungarian dreadnoughts. Now, granted, Svent Istvan did have its fair share of problems, largely thanks to being built in a yard for political reasons that had never built anything bigger than a destroyer. And yes, there were some problems with ventilation in the turrets, etc., as a result, which were picked up during the raid on Ancona. But those issues were fixed, and whilst there are some shortcomings to the Tegetthoff design, the same as there are some shortcomings to a lot of different dreadnought designs of the period, they're not useless. They're relatively decent combatants, and as I've said before, if you gave the design spec to a shipyard that had a lot of experience with building warships, even a lot of the faults that you can usually lay at the feet of the Tegetthoffs probably could have been worked out even before they were completed. So, they're not the absolute top end, but, they're pretty solid entries, all things considered. And since this is almost going to be 10 minutes, I think reaching back further into pre-dreadnoughts, ironclads, Age of Sail, if there's a single common thread that I would pull out of all of that, even going back into ancient times, I would say it's probably a habit that you see quite a lot of, which is insert dominant naval power of the period here, whether that be Britain, France, Spain, Rome, the Hanseatic League, the Ottomans, or whatever, insert dominant naval power here, really didn't know how to build ships, their crews were rubbish, their ships were rubbish, blah, 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 and they were clearly supplanted by a much superior force. It's like, no, those navies were dominant at the time for a very good reason, and it was usually the fact that they had certainly better crews, usually better ships. Sometimes you can make arguments about the specific capabilities of ships, but usually it comes down to the side that was dominant normally had better ships for seakeeping and generally being at sea for prolonged periods, even if they may not necessarily be the biggest or the fastest. And usually they also would have some form of technological edge. This is kind of why they were dominant. Now, if someone comes along and comes up with a more advanced ship design, more advanced technology, or the dominant power lapses and its fleet size starts to shrink and the crews start to have less and less experience, then, you get a supplantation by another upcoming power. But dominant naval powers don't get to be dominant by being generally rubbish and just spamming large numbers of ships out into the ocean. Even the Punic Wars, Carthage versus Rome, whilst granted the Romans were somewhat on the back foot and they did spam out a vast number of ships, they still weren't the absolute inept beginners that some accounts would have you believe when it came to the Carthaginians, even though, arguably one-on-one the Carthaginians were potentially a little bit better than Rome. Riva asks, one of the standout features of seeing HMS Victory was where the massive wooden beams were curved, following the grain, in specific shapes for holding the ship together. It seems something like that would place a major lead time on any sort of revolutionary design that wanted a big hunk of wood in a shape that wasn't previously needed, if it took a couple of decades to grow the part. Could you give a summary of just what the process was like to effectively bonsai an entire oak tree, given it surely can't have been luck? How long and how difficult was such a process, and how common were such specialist bits of framing in the ship? Well, believe it or not, you didn't normally shape oaks for naval service, and there's a few reasons for this. There's an absolute massive amount of correspondence, believe it or not, and a lot of vitriol thrown back and forth in the 1700s and 1800s regarding pretty much this exact topic, where occasionally someone will show up and say, we should prune off the dead branches, we should try and shape these boughs in a way that's useful for the Navy. And then an absolute tidal wave of people turn up, shipwrights, forest keepers, etc., who just have to say, no, under no circumstances should you touch the tree. Let it grow naturally. The only exception they seem to make is, and there's a commonly stated exception, if a bough has gotten completely rotten and it looks like that rot is going to spread back into the tree or into perhaps a larger bough that it's grown from, then okay, fine. In that case, to save the entire tree, get rid of it, but only in those cases. And a number of people actually specifically say they've never seen a tree that was pruned that produced timber fit for service in the Royal Navy. Now, apart from that, there's another rather major point, which is that when an oak tree is planted, it takes at least 60 years to grow to a size where it's going to be useful in any way for naval timber, and quite often trees over 100 or 150 years old would be considered as being the best. The thing is, there is absolutely no way that you can guarantee what kind of specifications you're going to need for a ship half a century to a century and a half down the line. And, the shaping of the timber, if you were going to try and do it, you would end up having to do, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before the ship was actually needed. And that's basically impossible, because you could end up, twisting and pinning and roping and binding an oak tree in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. And you could end up with, the perfect oak to cut to make into sections to build a race-built galleon. Only by the time it's ready to be built, the early ships of the line are all the rage, and race-built galleons are a century out of date. So that's kind of a problem. Now, at the same time, this doesn't necessarily mean that they just had to go patrolling the oak forests of Britain and abroad going, okay, we need a timber that's at least, 3 feet thick once it's been cut and trimmed, and it's got to be bent at exactly 70 degrees or something like that, and then just hope they found something that occurred naturally. Although one of the many reasons oak was preferred was because it did tend to have some of these more weird and wonderful large angles on some of its growth, especially when boughs meet the trunk. But what the other thing they did do, and if you go to Chatham Dockyard, you'll see this on one of their exhibition routes, is they actually steamed and bent timbers to shape. Now, that might sound a little bit difficult to believe, considering A, it's the age of sail, and B, sometimes you could be talking about fairly substantial timbers, but it is in fact the case. They had big chambers that basically they would rough cut the beam to, and then they would enclose the beam in the chamber, because usually it was actually easier to have an iron box or similar that you would then put around the timber than move the timber into a standard size box. And then it would be steamed, which would then allow you to bend it, obviously, and shape it, not massively, but enough. So if, for example, at the stern of the ship where the keel, ideally you want the keel to be able to sweep upwards into, let's say, the stern post or something like that, you might, on your diagram, go, okay, well, according to this, as compared to a right angle triangle, we want the stern post to be leaning back by, let's say, 15 degrees. So you need a total angle between keel and stern post of 105 degrees. And you find a bit of timber, a bit of oak, and the boughs growing, maybe it's hanging down, it's hanging low. So when you cut the tree down, you've got this nice thick bough and a good section of the trunk, and you measure it, you go, that's 110 degrees, but we want 105. That's, you might be able to correct it by that much. For example, I'm just pulling slightly random numbers, but that's the kind of thing you'd be getting. It wouldn't be a case of, well, here's a 45 degree angle bit of timber. Well, if we steam it enough, we can get it up to 105. That's not going to happen. But small corrections were possible. And between the natural growth states of oak timber and these very ingenious inventions in the Royal Dockyards and elsewhere, they were able to shape the timber post-cutting to what they needed. Nick Brodar asks, the US Alaska-class large cruisers spent less than 3 years in commission. Were there any ship classes in commission for a shorter time, when considered as a class as a whole? There are a few, but it's a little bit of a difficult one to answer precisely, because when you look at the Alaskas, obviously they went into service, then they went out of service in terms of active service, but they were kept in the reserves for quite a while, but they were never brought back. Whereas other ships, which potentially had a similar or even shorter active service career, sometimes were brought back considerably later, or were brought back in some other form, which can make things a little bit difficult to pin down. So, for example, the wartime-built Commencement Bay class escort carriers, one of which you can see here, which, hilariously enough, by this stage, the escort carriers had grown to a point where they actually carried more aircraft than some light fleet carriers at the beginning of the war, and even some ships that were classed as full fleet carriers in the interwar period. But in any case, a number of the Commencement Bay class were in service for less than 2 years. Now, they were then either taken to the reserves or taken in as training vessels or whatever, and some of them were brought back into service in the 1950s, at least we were talking about the war builds. But in terms of their active frontline service in their original role, the war build Commencement Bays were around generally for less time than the Alaskas. Another example is the Courageous class, Courageous and Furious, because they start service with the Royal Navy at near enough the end of 1916, and basically as soon as the dust has settled from World War I, they're straight into the reserves, never to emerge again in their role as large light cruisers or small battle cruisers or whatever it is you want to call them. So that's a service period of just a fraction over 2 years. Now, of course, Courageous and Glorious would return out of the reserves and as training vessels as conversions into carriers, and they would serve for a couple of decades as aircraft carriers, but their commission time as their original design was actually less than the Alaskas. And that's basically the trend. If you want to find ships that have a commission time of less than 3 years, basically look for ships that are just commissioning towards the end of a very large, very major war. And you'll usually find at least either some very ill-advised designs or some designs that are pretty good but are now surplus to requirements because they're sort of spec'd to the needs of that war, and then when the war's over, there's no need for them anymore. John McCarthy asks, why was Nagumo left in charge of the Kido Butai after the Midway disaster? Was it part of the Navy's attempt to keep the losses secret from everybody, especially the Army? It wasn't so much that he was left in charge to conceal things. I think, well, and there would have been a small element of that because, as we know, the Japanese tried to conceal what had happened at Midway for a while. So, if you say, oh, yes, well, we've had a decisive victory at Midway, or at least a score draw, immediately relieving the commander who'd supposedly led you to that magnificent victory or score draw would seem a little suspicious. Nonetheless, he was not left in charge of the Kido Butai, apart from the fact that Kido Butai had kind of ceased to exist with the Battle of Midway in any case, but he was reassigned to command of the Third Fleet, which was basically Shokaku Suikaku, which is why he shows up at the Guadalcanal campaign, because he's in charge of that force. You could argue being put in charge of Third Fleet, which in some ways is kind of the equivalent of being put in charge of a US fast carrier group, is already a bit of a step down from commanding, the combined force of your Navy's entire main fleet carrier strength. Although at the same time, that probably was the best command going for someone who's commanding aircraft carriers, because, well, you didn't have the fleet's main carrier combined strength because you just lost it all. Never mind. But after a few months in charge of that during the Guadalcanal campaign, he was then reassigned to a shore position and basically never allowed out to command at sea again. And, a small part of that will have been because, if you think about it, the Battle of Coral Sea had already derailed the careers of a number of Japanese aircraft carrier commanders. And not only had the Battle of Midway, to a certain, I think, degree, put a downward spiral on Nagumo's own career, but it had also taken out a good chunk of other senior Japanese officers who might otherwise have been put in his position relatively quickly. For example, if Admiral Yamaguchi had survived, then regardless of what you might think of him as an officer or of his particular tactics, you could potentially see a case being made, at least internally in the Japanese Navy, that Nagumo was left in overall charge and failed to do anything much to harm the Americans other than shoot down a bunch of devastators, whereas Yamaguchi, who is an admiral and a relatively senior one, although he's lost his ship, he actually is responsible for taking out Yorktown. So he actually did something, so maybe we should have him in charge instead. But of course, Yamaguchi goes down with his ship and is not around. So in the immediate aftermath of Midway, once you take into account those lost at Midway and those who have been decided to be not capable of being in command of carriers thanks to Coral Sea, Nagumo is one of a very, very, very small pool of people left, and he has seniority, and you have, as we mentioned, a degree of not wanting to immediately admit what the disaster that Midway actually was. And so I think that's why he's left in charge for a little bit, and then almost as soon as they can find an excuse, he's off to shore duties. People like Azawa, etc., didn't have a huge amount of experience operating with carriers and were relatively junior at the end of 1942. Greb asks, in the last few dry docks, you talked about your idea of an all-forward main battery battleship, so I thought I'd ask your opinion of the world of warships British battleship-battlecruisers Duncan and St. Vincent. What would you call their layout? All-forward or something else? And how effective of a ship do you think they'd be? Well, Duncan in World of Warships is based on the G3 class battlecruiser designs. It basically is the G3's just slightly modernised. And St. Vincent is the I3, which is not the immediate predecessor of G3, as the alphabet would suggest, but it is, with I3, it's pretty much what I would characterise as the last truly serious attempt by the British to fit 18-inch guns on their battlecruiser designs in the early 1920s. I don't really count the attempts immediately after that as truly serious, because they're just reaching at that stage. Nonetheless, they're kind of all forward, in as much as, yes, they are grouping all of their armament forward of the machinery spaces, which is also what Nelson and Richelieu and Dunkirk and Tournai, etc., do. But it's not clustering them all in exactly the same block, because in both cases you have A and B turrets, and then you have what's arguably a Q turret immediately aft of the bridge superstructure. Although it does bring most of the benefits of a Nelson, Richelieu, Dunkirk, Tournai style all forward grouping. So I would call this, I mean, technically I would call this semi all forward grouping or semi forward grouping, but as just a rule of thumb, you can pretty much treat it as all forward. It's aiming towards the same kind of benefits as a truly all forward arrangement is. But what's my opinion of them? Well, I, as you probably know, I'm a big fan of the G3 design historically, and in the game, I really like my Duncan class. Now, I'm not entirely sure what it is, because, of course, as anyone who plays World of Warships regularly will know, if you have a Tier 9 vessel, the chances of you ever getting a Tier 7, 8, 9 game are very, very slim. You almost always are going to end up as the second tier in a Tier 10 game, which logically would make you think that the more heavily armed St. Vincent, i.e. I3 at the Tier 10, would perform better in your average game. But for whatever reason, I tend to find that I do better in my Duncan. I'm not entirely sure why, but I enjoy the experience a lot more, so I would have to say of the two, it's my favourite. Now, as far as kind of a 5 minutes into the future idea of what would the ships have looked like had they been built, of course, you know, they're pretty good renditions of that idea. And particularly, again, I like the Duncan because whilst I3 is a very interesting design, the Royal Navy did ditch it at the concept stage, whereas G3, whatever they were going to be called, was actually ordered, materials gathered for the construction, etc. So it was very, very close to coming to pass. It didn't, but because it was so close to coming to pass and there was an intention to build the things, then I think looking at Duncan and going, well, this is maybe what they would have looked like had they been built and then survived into World War II, I think is quite fun, and I like them. And in terms of effectiveness, well, carrying on with the G3, I think they would have been very effective, because if you look at their armament, armour and speed specs, they're close, very close to basically being an Iowa 20 years early. People can make lots of arguments about the finer details, but broadly they're similar. Obviously, they don't have quite the same power as the 16-inch 50 guns, but then, as originally conceived, neither was Iowa. And if she had been built, I mean, the thing is, again, this comes into like first, second, or third order alternate histories. Just on paper, if the G3s had been allowed to be built for whatever reason, then going forward into World War II, the G3s would have had a massive advantage, at least on paper, if they'd been even halfway modernised, over pretty much any treaty-era battleship, whether that be a King George V, a South Dakota, a North Carolina, Bismarck, Littorio, etc., etc. Post-treaty ships, or complete treaty-breaking ships like Yamato or Iowa, is a different matter. But, of course, that's assuming that everybody just built as they did, whereas even if the G3's design had been built or substantially built before the treaty was signed, and somehow they'd got grandfathered in under a similar clause to Hood, maybe the Royal Navy said, okay, well, we started construction on the G3s, and let's say artificially somehow they magically start the construction on them a year earlier. So like, the hole's in the water, so let us finish the two G3s, and then between the two G3s and Hood, they're older ships, but we'll accept those, and everyone else can have their new 16-inch battleships, whether it be Colorados or Nagants. It wouldn't have happened, but hand-waving that it somehow magically did. You would then have the question at the latter part of the 1930s, everybody's designing new capital ships, and you have these rather too big G3-shaped overlords sitting there in the back, at which point people are hopefully, theoretically, most likely going to be designing their ships with those ships in mind, at which point what you might then see constructed is not going to be the historical construction of World War II. Roadrunner Meep Meep asks, would the Fubuki class have been better off if they'd been built with the 100mm turrets of the Akizuki in place of the 5-inch guns they originally had? Would it have solved some of the top weight issues? And would destroyers avoid further restrictions in the London Treaty now that the Fubuki does not have the gun, torpedo and speed combo that her real-life counterpart had? Well, the big elephant in the room, of course, is that the Akizuki's 100mm gun wasn't actually developed. Bearing in mind it's a Type 98, i.e. a 1938 gun. It wasn't developed until 12 years after the construction of Fubuki began. So there is no way, in reality, for Fubuki to be constructed with this weapon, because, I mean, the very last of the Fubukis was commissioned still over half a decade before the 100mm gun development actually started. But if we hand-wave that away, or we just say it's time-travelled or whatever, each of the guns weighs 4.2 tons for the 5-inch and just a fraction over 3 tons for the 3.9-inch, the 100mm. So at that point, you're saving about 1.2 tons per gun. So for 6 guns, you're saving near enough to make no difference, about 7 tons. That's not a huge amount. But in order to accommodate things like the additional power service, so power training, and the fact that the gun mountings could elevate considerably higher on the 100mm, the actual mounting weight for the 100mm twin is about the same as the true dual-purpose 5-inch mount, around 34 to 35 tons. Now, the Fubuki specifically, because sometimes the Fubuki is seen as a run of 3, there's 3 subclasses. Sometimes the Fubuki is listed as only the first one, which has up to 40 degrees elevation. Sometimes everything's categorized as that, but the first run has only up to 40 degree elevation, and that has a lighter mount, which makes things potentially slightly worse. But essentially, you're only going to be saving, you're going to be saving less than 10 tons, at least in terms of the weight of the gun and mounting that you're installing. Now, granted, you might then save a little bit on ammunition, but if you've mandated X 100 rounds per mount or per gun, if you have the same number of rounds, then obviously the 100mm will weigh somewhat less than the 5-inch, and so you'll save a little bit more weight there. But I suspect the Japanese will probably just use the higher rate of fire and the individually smaller shells to just up the number of shells stored in the magazines. So it would have made them considerably more effective, but it would not have solved the top weight issues, and not by much, and it also wouldn't have stopped the changes to the destroyer categorizations in the London Naval Treaty, because she'd still be an insanely powerful ship, especially with a very, very capable dual-purpose gun, even if it's a little bit smaller than the one that she originally had. But if you somehow did it, obviously faster training, faster firing, higher elevation, weapons, and faster reloading, that they would be significantly better than they were historically. Glenn Ricafrente asks, what do you think of Admiral Robert Burnett, who commanded British cruiser squadrons in 2 major actions in the Arctic, the Battle of the Barents Sea and the Battle of the North Cape? I'll be perfectly honest. I haven't given Admiral Burnett a huge amount of thought during my various bits of research. Obviously, you come across him in those two engagements aboard with Sheffield and Jamaica under his command at Barents Sea, and Belfast, Norfolk, and Sheffield again under his command at North Cape. But from what I have seen, he seems to have been a fairly solid and capable officer. I mean, he was in command of the largest vessels at Barents Sea on the British side, and that's a pair of Town-class cruisers. On paper, he's facing off against Admiral Hipper and Lutzow, which, on paper, that's two heavy cruisers, which are significantly outmassing and outgunning his two light cruisers. But he manages to pull off a win by ending up actually engaging both of them separately, damaging Hipper, forcing Lutzow to retreat. So he made the best of a situation that could have gone very, very badly for him. And at the same time, when you look at his conduct leading the cruisers at North Cape, he seems to have played his cards about as well as you could imagine. He's managed to take 3 cruisers, 2 light, 1 heavy, which ostensibly should not have stood a chance against something like Scharnhorst, and with relatively minimal damage, he's managed to first drive off Scharnhorst, and then following Fraser's instructions, despite the fact that Norfolk and Sheffield, for various reasons, have had to fall back, he takes his flagship, which is Belfast, and manages to successfully tail Scharnhorst through the darkness and through the snow, and essentially give such perfect instructions to Fraser that he hands Scharnhorst to Fraser and Duke of York pretty much on a platter. So I think, my impression is one of a very solid, dependable officer who is pretty good at playing the cruisers that are under his command to his maximum advantage. Salamin Shakir 93 asks, about the likely shell that sank Hood, if the 3-inch lower belt beneath the 12-inch belt abreast the boiler rooms extended further aft down to the level where it is in the way of said shell, can this 3-inch belt plus the 1.5-inch bulkhead behind it make a difference by either deflecting or slowing the shell enough so that it detonates before reaching the 4-inch magazine? And what is the purpose of this belt in the first place, and why is it thicker abreast the boiler rooms whilst only 0.75 inches at the magazines and engine rooms? Well, if you look at this diagram where you can just about see that little bit just below the main 12-inch belt, the 3-inch underneath abreast the boiler rooms, as far as I can tell, seems to have been put in there because as designed, you can see the waterline only has about maybe 30-40% of Hood's main belt underwater, and so splash damage, amidships torpedo hits, potentially fragments, maybe the occasional shell that's just got expending the last of its energy, it would be useful to protect against, and hence this, to be fair, very, very narrow, very shallow strake of armour. As for why it's not continued elsewhere, I suspect that's probably a weight consideration and the fact that boilers are considered slightly more vital in terms of machinery, because if you take a hit to an engine room and you lose a turbine, that's bad, but you've got, at least in theory on most capital ships, another 3 turbines to run with, assuming that you have all your turbines in separate rooms, of course. Whereas if you have boilers lost, then the power that's lost in those boilers, one, if a turbine gets hit, turbine failure is quite catastrophic in and of itself, but damage to a turbine or an engine room that contains a turbine that causes the turbine to stop is usually going to kill far fewer people than exploding a boiler would. And of course, as I said, when the boiler loses power, the whole ship loses that power, which is a significantly worse issue. And the magazines have unlike the boiler rooms, do have a degree of their own in protection as well. Now, as for if that was in the way of the shell, I mean, as I've said with the theory that I've espoused before, it's a very, very narrow slot that this shell has to fit through. But, and whether or not it's because the trough caused by the bow wave in this area, which is attested to not only in pictures but also in video of HMS Hood as well as other similar hull-form ships. In any case, whether that is deep enough at the actual moment to allow the shell to just slip in entirely, or whether it's deep enough that the shell still has to pass through water, but has to pass through considerably less water, thus, still being able to fit through underneath the main armor belt. Neither here nor there, but 3 inches of armor is not going to stop the thing cold, so it's not going to stop the shell and have it explode in the torpedo defenses, etc. It will, however, slow the shell down somewhat. It will potentially initiate the fuse just that fraction earlier, depending on when the fuse was initiated. If it passed through a shallow bit of water, the fuse was already initiated. If it hit the side of the ship, then at some point passing through the ship, the fuse would have been initiated, but potentially, depending on exactly which part it hit that caused the fuse to initiate, this might initiate it sooner. But I think the bigger thing is it's going to significantly reduce the velocity of the shell. Now, what that means is that, assuming that my theory is correct, which of course I think it is, otherwise it wouldn't be my theory. I'm not going to hold to something I don't think actually works. But assuming that the shell passes through just below the 12-inch belt, and they've extended this 3-inch belt across the machinery spaces, I think that would slow or deflect the shell enough that it would probably detonate in the aft machinery spaces rather than passing through the bulkhead and into the 4-inch AA magazines. Or it might, hit the aft bulkhead and then detonate. So you potentially have one of two scenarios. Either you just have splinters hitting the aft bulkhead and nothing else, or potentially you have a detonation against the aft bulkhead. In the first case, where it's just splinters, then you'd have, a bit of a problem with the hood's turbines, or some of them at least. If it hits the bulkhead, then there's a possibility that, and then explodes, there's a possibility of quite a lot of splinters and explosions still reaching the 4-inch magazines, but potentially not starting a fire that's vociferous enough that it can't be put out by either water spray flooding the magazine, or the water that's just about to enter by the turbine room. Just splinters means there's an even greater chance that any fire started in the 4-inch magazine could be put out. So in either case, it is less likely the 4-inch magazine would explode, but in both cases there is still a possibility of either a 4-inch magazine fire or a magazine explosion, but it is much reduced compared to the historical most likely scenario. At which point, Hood would be, in terms of the fight, probably be crippled, because she'll have lost at least one, possibly two of her turbines, and will be having major flooding in that machinery space. But she's not dead yet. Now, of course, what any subsequent follow-up hits from Bismarck might do remains open, but it is possible, therefore, ironically enough, that then would actually engage with the scenario I put together for the video where Hood survives, where I posited that, the shell just explodes in the engine room, Hood heels out of line, dropping in speed and is forced to fall back. This would pretty much be a scenario where that could happen, as long as the fire suppression systems in the 4-inch magazine were up to snuff.